Committee on Natural Resources will now come to order. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the environmental policymaking, the role of environmental organizations, and grant-making foundations. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designee. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that any in-person meetings, as an in-person meeting, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform the committee immediately. Thank you. I would like now to begin the opening statements, and let me extend the opportunity to the ranking member if you would like any opening statements before our witnesses begin. Mr. Westerman, if you're here.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. I would like to start by recognizing our colleague from Utah, Representative Blake Moore, who has agreed to serve as the ranking Republican on the Oversight Investigation Subcommittee for the rest of this Congress. Representative Moore has been an active member of this committee from day one and is the current vice-ranking member of the O&I Subcommittee. I know his experiences in the public and private sectors will serve him well in this new role. Now on to the business at hand. The majority has convened this hearing to discuss the nexus between the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in our nation's environmental policymaking. I would argue that rather than the abstract, our focus should be on how environmental policies impact communities across the nation. Actions mean more than just words. And I think from our witness testimony today and our members' questions, we'll see that the actions of my colleagues across the aisle are actually disenfranchising people rather than helping people. According to the Interior Department's Environmental Justice Vision Statement, the department hopes to manage natural resources, and I quote, in a manner that is sustainable, equitable, accessible, and inclusive of all populations, end quote. The communities the environmental justice movement aims to include in the decision-making process, however, are the very ones being harmed by the Biden administration's policies. And the echo chamber of environmental groups often supports these bad policies. Let's use the Biden administration's energy policies as an example. At the end of 2021, inflation reached a 40-year high, increasing costs for American families. In fact, the average American family is estimated to have spent $1,200 more on energy costs in 2021 than they did in 2020. Some estimate that 20% of Americans struggle to pay their energy bills in full at least once last year. Seeing such increases leaves Americans wondering, why are my energy costs getting more expensive? The answer in part is that the Biden administration, with the support of environmental groups, is so focused on environmental justice, constantly attacking the oil and gas industry and threatening our nation's domestic supply of energy, ultimately driving up energy costs. This committee has previously heard testimony from Derek Hawley, an advocate for energy affordability, who, for example, explained how decreasing the availability of affordable domestic energy most negatively impacts low-income, minority, and rural communities. Yet, the Biden administration and Democrats continue to advance policy positions that jeopardize the availability of cheap and reliable domestic energy supplies, curtailing affordable energy for these communities. So, while we can spend time talking about the virtues of including underrepresented communities in policy discussions, actions by the left have increased cost burdens for the very same people they purport to help. Unfortunately, as environmental groups push for more regulations and red tape, we can only expect to see harsher financial burdens from these misguided policies. That's why it's so important for local communities and the communities targeted by the environmental justice movement to be given a real voice. Imposing a radical environmental agenda has real consequences for our American families. We need a wide variety of opinions and the presence of diversity of thought. What does this look like in practice? It means all sides of an issue are heard. Environmental policy decisions should not be made in an echo chamber where everyone already agrees on an outcome. Diversity of thought means that although an environmental group wages a national campaign to oppose energy development, the voices of local community members on all sides of the issue are considered and respected. In practice, it means the real-life economic and local benefits of energy development have equal weight in the decision-making process. But a commitment to diversity of thought requires follow-through. That's what has been lacking in this administration and what's missing in this usual exercise of confirmation bias. Our witness today, Mr. Freeland, will share firsthand experience of how the Biden administration refused to include the Navajo Nation in important policy discussions regarding land use in the Chaco Canyon area of New Mexico, directly impacting Navajo landowners. The Biden administration has disregarded the personal property rights of Navajo allottees. In fact, even though Interior Secretary Holland traveled all the way to New Mexico to announce a mineral withdrawal, she never took the time to meet with or consult the allottees whose mineral rights would be impacted. That is not equity or inclusivity, and the Biden administration's decision surely did not account for any diversity of thought. The result simply does not seem just. If we are serious about achieving more diverse and inclusive environmental policies, we must ensure that the communities impacted by those decisions are given a seat at the table. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Westerman. Thank you for your comments, and let me recognize myself for 5 minutes. I want to thank all of you for being here today. I want to thank the witnesses for contributing their expertise and perspectives on this very important conversation about the need to advance justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI, into the environmental policymaking. Since the inception of America's mainstream environmental movement, it has generally been dominated by male, white, affluent leadership, and initially as the primary constituency. And so early conservation efforts in this country were rooted in a troubling ideology of racism and colonialism, a legacy that weighs down efforts to address the most pressing environmental issues as we face as a country and as a world. When I first got elected to Congress, and I asked to be on this resources committee, a committee that not only do I enjoy working on, but it's something that I have a passion for. There was a lot of questions as to why I would want to be on a resources committee when I should be on a committee that would affect my community or communities of color, having to do with healthcare, civil rights, education. I have a strong interest in that. I'm involved. I've been involved at all levels with the Education and Workforce Committee since my tenure in Congress. Yet the stereotype was that I should only focus on that because the other issue was the predominant issue of someone else. I mean, these preconceptions and stereotypes about people of color, whether they're members of Congress or not, have prevented policymakers from achieving better environmental and public health outcomes because communities were not present. But since on this committee, there's been great progress, and since becoming chair and formerly ranking member, this committee has held hearings to examine barriers and solutions to advancing JEDI in federal environmental agencies and agency policymaking. The committee also has intentionally solicited and included more diverse perspectives in the legislative process through either witnesses or through expertise that we have recruited to present to this committee as we make our environmental laws more equitable and more comprehensive. But the laws and policies are not created in a vacuum. Many actors affect the outcomes, and non-governmental organizations, the foundations that found them, often play a pivotal role in the policy development, as does the development community, the extraction industry, the energy corporations, the gas and oil companies, and the mining conglomerates that continue to have an outside influence on policy making, on the emphasis and the priorities of policy making, and who's at the table and who's not at the table. Their influence cannot be underestimated. And as we go forward, that influence requires oversight as well, as does past practices and the current snapshot of where we're at with the agency of our primary agency of jurisdiction, which is the Department of Interior. Where are they at in this snapshot in terms of JEDI, in terms of inclusion, in terms of diversity? And we will see that that pattern is also an internal pattern. And so the oversight will be about that snapshot, but it'll also be about what are the plans, actions, timeline for beginning to address the need to be more integrated, more inclusive, and have diverse voices available to guide general environmental policy. Uh, the environmental policies that this committee legislates and the federal agencies under its jurisdiction can only benefit from having a deep understanding and a commitment to JEDI. Here in the committee, we also have come to the principal conclusion that we have significant benefits in our legislative process. Yet for decades, many mainstream organizations have excluded the voices of those who are most impacted. And I agree with the ranking member. The communities most impacted, those that had disproportionately been put aside and not brought into the process and not been part of the process, those very same communities are seeking our help. These results in policy solutions that fail to meet or gain the support of most of the marginalized communities across this country, whether it is rural America, urban America, coastal America, Plains America, Southwest America, those communities, Indigenous America, don't feel included and feel more marginalized. And so the failure to advance a JEDI into mainstream environmental movement, into the agency itself, has severely limited Congress's ability to meet its goals and address its environmental crisis before us. And we have lost time, money, and in some cases, lives. It is clear that mainstream environmental movements' traditional strategy risks losing relevance and impact as our nation becomes more diverse and our communities are increasingly challenged and ravaged by climate change. Uh, Many mainstream organizations have made significant strides in the past decades in advancing JEDI in recent years. Work remains, and we have very little time to waste. The moral case in pursuing this just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive environmental policy should be obvious, but the pragmatic case is new to many. It is seen as something foreign, something attacking something. On the contrary, it's an inclusive policy. Even the National Academy of Sciences has said that we cannot decarbonize the economy without an inclusive policy that reaches all. With that, I want to, before introducing today's witnesses, I will remind.
Would the chairman yield?
Let me introduce the witnesses and we'll go into that. Mr. Cohen, I don't think I have any time, but please, let me give you a few seconds if you don't mind. Sir, you're recognized. Okay, before introducing, let me proceed. I will remind non-administrative witnesses that they are encouraged to participate in a survey that will be provided by the staff. Let me remind the witnesses that our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will start. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining and red when your time is expired. I recommend the members and the witnesses joining remotely to use stage view so they may pin the timer on the screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself and to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will also allow the entire panel to testify before turning to the members for questions to the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Ms. Kea Chatterjee, the Executive Director of the U.S. Climate Action Network. Ms. Chatterjee, the time is yours, and you have 5 minutes. You're recognized. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair Grijalva. Good morning. My name is Kea Chatterjee. I use she, her pronouns, and I am located on unceded Piscataway and Nacotchtank land known as Washington, D.C. I am the Executive Director of the U.S. Climate Action Network, USCAN. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Our position at USCAN is that the federal government, large mainstream environmental organizations, and foundation grant-making processes have been exclusionary to Black and Brown communities. This exclusion has resulted in failed attempts to pass durable climate policy because policymakers have ignored the very people who have an organized community behind them. For example, my own experience working at a large white-led NGO was that while there was a focus on diversity in the workforce, there was a lack of retention because of a lack of commitment to justice. A true focus on justice corrects past harms and mitigates future harms. Our intent in providing this testimony is to influence grant giving and the federal policy-making process so that Black, Indigenous, and Brown communities have full inclusion in decision-making processes. It is only through agency being returned to Black and Brown communities that people will have the access and power necessary to implement climate solutions. The barriers to participation in policy processes are significant. One huge one is jargon. Sometimes the most harmful policies are spoken about in the most opaque terms. Members of USCAN, for example, have had to suffer pollution and enormous costs of carbon capture and storage facility in Mississippi. And there are threats of more of these facilities in communities that do not want them, in Louisiana and across the Southeast surrounding Black and Brown communities. These proposals would be paired with a massive network of compressed CO2 pipelines in every community that has worked so hard to fight back against pipelines scarring their lands. The effort, however, is not called compressed CO2 pipelines to keep coal pollution in Black and Brown communities. What does the federal government call it instead? It's called 45Q. What does 45Q mean exactly? Well, you're meant to feel dumb if you don't know, and the answer is truly irrelevant for communities that are being poisoned. This kind of meaningless jargon is no accident. It emerges from a culture that does not value community organizers and the language that we use within our own communities. It doesn't have to be that way. Changes are needed for federal grant making and policy making. The federal grant process is lengthy, time-consuming, and onerous. Nonprofits without resources are at a significant disadvantage. Knowing this, USCAN's own grant program process is intentionally set up to take the applicant less than 3 hours total. I'll share a few of our top recommendations for grant giving based on our experience in adaptively improving grants. No jargon, of course. Second, require 60% representation of women of color, BIPOC, and vulnerable communities in boards and staff or grantor and grantee organizations. Next, adopt and operationalize a JEDI checklist that's used in all operations. Another is to have a maximum annual operating budget cap. We use $500,000 as an eligibility requirement for recipients. Finally, identify grants and policy programs that result in systemic remedies and don't just address an immediate issue. For example, don't just address flooding, address the root cause of why communities of color were pushed onto vulnerable flooding lands, address how the climate crisis is playing out in communities that are repeatedly flooding. The climate crisis would not exist if not for a system of white supremacy in which we operate, meaning a system designed so that people of European descent have better outcomes. Where would you place a poisonous coal-fired power plant, an exploding pipeline, or a polluting biomass facility if policymakers were not willing to sacrifice communities of color? These facilities are regularly rejected by wealthy white communities, so if not for white supremacy, we would have transitioned to solar, wind, and batteries long ago and before my time. The reality is that white supremacy and colonialism began the process of attacking and dismantling indigenous ways of living that are connected to the land and that can sustain a stable climate on Earth. In closing, I would like to reiterate that having this hearing is extremely important in the context we are in as a nation and a global community with reference to the climate crisis. We are grappling with a history of systemic impact on communities of color that has never been addressed and the perpetuation of injustice. There are significantly better alternatives that have been tried and tested, and I hope the examples and recommendations that I have shared illuminate that and play a part in achieving a paradigm shift that is long overdue. Thank you once again for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much for your testimony. And let me now turn to recognizing Mr. Abdul Dossunmu, campaign manager for the Climate Funders Justice Pledge at the Donors of Color Network. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Westerman, for this opportunity to address members of the House on this important topic. Addressing and mitigating the impacts of climate change is the single most important issue we face as humanity. I have a deep background in racial justice, having served in the Obama administration at the U.S. Department of Transportation and having founded a voting rights organization called the Young Black Lawyers Organizing Coalition. And I bring that same racial justice lens to the work I do now to help shift the center of gravity in climate philanthropy. And I am pleased to be here today to talk about the Donors of Color Network and the Climate Funders Justice Pledge. The Donors of Color Network is the first ever cross-racial community of high net worth donors of color and movement leaders committed to building the collective power of people of color to achieve racial justice and shift the center of gravity in both politics and philanthropy. 1 year ago, we launched the Climate Funders Justice Pledge to shift the center of gravity in philanthropy towards racial and economic justice by challenging the nation's top climate funders to commit publicly to greater transparency and to giving at least 30% of their U.S. climate funding to the BIPOC-led justice groups that have an outsized impact in beating back the climate crisis. To date, we have spoken to 36 of the top 40 climate funders in the United States, and so far, 26 funders have taken the pledge, including 8 funders who are in the top 40 in terms of assets. In just 1 year, we project that tens of millions of dollars in new resources will have been shifted to BIPOC-led organizations. But there are still far too many funders sitting on the sidelines, and that has to change. A new school study in collaboration with Building Equity and Alignment found that of the $1.34 billion awarded to 12 national environmental funders, only 1.3% of it goes to BIPOC-led justice groups. 1.3% isn't just a moral failing. It's an ineffective and losing strategy. No winning social movement has succeeded without the leadership and guidance of a multiracial coalition. BIPOC leaders and organizations are the driving forces behind some of the most expansive climate policy in the country, whether it's indigenous organizers disrupting billions of tons of greenhouse gas emissions annually, or BIPOC organizations driving forward the New Jersey and California environmental justice laws that preceded President Biden's Justice 40 initiative. And that's despite receiving a grossly inequitable share of funding. Moreover, even though we know that the impacts of climate change hit low-income communities and communities of color first and worst, most climate efforts are primarily focused on strategies that prioritize the wealthy. That's because philanthropy is a space that largely lacks meaningful diversity in its leadership ranks. As a result, the funder community has inherent implicit biases in grant making that historically have meant that communities of color are overlooked and under-resourced. We must push these foundations beyond their biases and their excuses. Funders will say they don't know how to find BIPOC-led organizations. Others will say they're not aware of BIPOC-led academic policy perspectives and solutions. In response, we have compiled an expansive list of BIPOC-led organizations and movement networks and developed the most comprehensive compilation of US-based BIPOC PhDs. Imagine if the BIPOC-led organizations that are leading the fight against the climate crisis were actually funded at the same level as their white counterparts. Imagine if they had the resources to export their work at scale. Imagine if our climate movement was actually holistic instead of grossly disproportionate. With your help, we can shine a light on the solutions, like getting the largest funders to be transparent about how inclusive their grant making is by taking the Climate Funders Justice Pledge. In closing, we asked the leadership of the top foundations one simple question. Do you think 1.3% is a winning number? And no one says yes. Change is possible. I and the Donors of Color Network would love to be a resource for you as you work to build a winning climate strategy that harnesses the power of BIPOC leaders and tips the scale toward true justice and progress. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. Appreciate your testimony. Now let me turn and recognize the Honorable Mark A. Freeland, delegate to the Navajo Nation Council. Sir, welcome, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, House Committee Natural Resources Chairman Rahul Gahalva and Ranking Member Bruce Westerman, and the subcommittee members of the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation. My name is Mark Freeland. I'm a 24th Navajo Nation Council, which is the legislative body of the Navajo Nation government. As a formal introduction by our Navajo custom, my maternal clan is Totoni, my paternal clan is Kia'ani, my maternal grandfather clan is Senjikene, and my paternal grandfather clan is Tenabethni. My clans define me as a Navajo and identify me to the ties of my people and to our great Navajo Nation. As a member of the 24th Navajo Nation Council, the governing body of the Navajo Nation, I'm honored and privileged to be a member of the Council's Natural Resources and Development Committee, which regulates oversight and authority by all of the Navajo Nation's water, land, environmental protection, cultural resources, minerals, and economic development, among other areas. The Navajo Nation is comprised of approximately 399,594 Navajo citizens, and covers 27,000 square miles of land in Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado. This area is subdivided into 110 chapter local governments that represent local voices of our people and work on the local level to see the needs of our people as well. I'm here today to testify on behalf of the Navajo people who have lived and still do live in and around the greater Chaco area since time immemorial. Their voices have been lost in the public discussions about oil and gas development activities and discussions regarding a buffer zone around Chaco Canyon National Historic Park. The White House has stated, as did Congress, that the rule would not apply to individual Indian allotments or to minerals within the area owned by private, state, or tribal entities. However, in reality, the rule would have a devastating impact because the indirect impacts would make the allottee land worthless from the standpoint of energy extraction. In attempts to negotiate with their congressional representatives, the Navajo Nation Council passed a legislation that agreed to reduce the size of the 10-mile buffer zone to 5 miles as a compromise to reduce the impact towards our Navajo allottees. We are willing to continue these discussions with federal government, but announcing this initiative at a White House Tribal Nation Summit, knowing that the Navajo Nation Council passed and local government entities have also passed resolutions in opposition, was unwarranted affront to the Navajo Nation. Navajos have lived in the Southwest since time immemorial as Navajo people. Our clans and our oral ceremonial history is tied to Chaco Canyon, the landscape. Much of our lifeways begin in the greater Chaco region. Our Navajo people are concerned about their lifeway ceremonials in the areas of plant, mineral, and gathering areas. We continue offering, as well as offering places, historic burials, as well as archaeological sites throughout the region, which are still in use today. Recently, Secretary Holland issued a proposed mineral withdrawal on federal lands from any development. The BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, published in the Federal Register on January 6, 2022, the proposed withdrawal of 351,479 acres of federal lands from development for a 20-year term. And we have some really strong concerns regarding this. Secretary Holland did not consult with the Navajo Nation before making this decision on federal action. In the announcement for the administrative decision, Ms. Holland was quoted as stating that the decision was based on the cultural resources investigation studies that tribe were awarded to conduct within the Chaco Canyon region. The Navajo Nation has yet to complete these ethnographic studies to date. The Navajo Nation sent a letter to her and to President Biden in December 2021, detailing our concerns regarding these activities in Eastern Navajo Agency. As of today, we have not gotten a response from President Biden or Secretary Holland. Let me remind you, the greater Chacoan landscape is a part of Navajo Nation lands and individual allotments. It's our front yard, it's our home. Secretary Holland has completely ignored and disregarded the executive directives given by President Biden regarding tribal consultation and federal actions and decisions. Withdrawal of land may affect development on Navajo trust lands and individual allotments, in particular, improving infrastructure to access minerals on these lands. The Department of Interior did not provide adequate notice nor offer consultation with the Navajo Nation prior to making this administrative decision. Most importantly, we asked the Department of Interior, the BLM, the BIA, the Biden-Harris administration to respect Navajo cultural connections to this landscape. Navajo people have lived in the Chaco region for immemorial generations and must be consulted in the same regards, giving consent regarding development of mineral resources and the impact to their quality of life. Engage in meaningful government-to-government consultation with the Navajo Nation and its people. In closing, myself and the 24th Navajo Nation Council respectfully and rightfully request, with collaborative efforts, and extend an invitation to the White House Natural Resources Committee to participate in a field hearing on the Navajo Nation and Eastern Navajo Agency, and we're located in Naizi chapter. This hearing would assist in the ongoing collaborations of the Navajo Nation, and your leadership in regards to this hearing and the Navajo Nation allottees and their voices towards these matters. Mr. Chairman, thank you, and God bless each and every one of you.
Thank you, Mr. Freeland and Delegate Freeland, and I appreciate your comments. And now let me recognize Mr. Peter Forbes, co-founder, First Light. Mr. Forbes, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, for your leadership in raising these issues. My name is Peter Forbes. I want you to know me as a farmer who works and earns a livelihood from the land in Abenaki territory, and as a white man committed to changing conservation culture. I believe in the promise of our public lands to tell a story about this nation that brings us together, gives us meaning, prepares us for the future. To care for the land isn't Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal. To care for the land isn't even reserved for environmentalists. To care is simply human. These beliefs led me to a career in conservation where I became an insider to national organizations. But my bedrock belief in people often made me an outsider to those same institutions where I mostly saw my own privileged white world celebrating the land while denying through intention and blind neglect those same benefits to others and their very history and experience of it. I come to you to share my own experience and to dialogue. My culture has always thought of itself as white angels. This isn't my concept. John Gass painted it in 1872 and named it American Progress. My culture has never reconciled what manifest destiny created, the two American atrocities of human enslavement and indigenous genocide. Every acre taken by manifest destiny was stolen from someone else, often violently. We have an opportunity now to create healing and reconciliation through an honest telling of history and its impacts. This is a map of indigenous land loss on this continent. Despite white settlers' best efforts over hundreds of years, indigenous people and their cultures were never removed from this continent, though dispossessed of land and life ways and still oppressed today. And here's a map of conservation land gain during the same time period. Rarely does conservation talk about its connection to the history of Black and Indigenous land dispossession. Too much we persist in seeing ourselves as white angels, saving the land, having the right answers, paternalistic, and reducing the agency of BIPOC communities, even as we preside over existential challenges such as species extinction, climate instability, social unrest, a burning continent. Our poets write their last love letters to last places while environmental culture remains insulated from the wisdom that has always been right here within other people. National Parks and Conservation Association is in that process of changing themselves by elevating BIPOC leaders and knowledge. They publicly challenged themselves to have at least 50% of their staff be people of color within 5 years. All of these environmental groups need to re-examine their own history and speak to their own past betrayals. Organizations like NPCA addressing race and history isn't mission drift, it's mission maturity. This is a genuine invitation to enter a dialogue on more equitable terms about what other cultures need from our public lands. The role of white leadership is to create our own cultural shifts and take direction from Black and Indigenous leaders. For example, in Maine, where our country's whitest population, 65 conservation groups there have organized themselves into First Light to take direction from Wabanaki leaders on what lands must be returned and how all lands must be better cared for. Conservation groups there have returned thousands of acres and granted access to 78,000 acres with more to come. This repairing and returning must become our long work if we're to mature beyond being white angels tossing breadcrumbs to seagulls. This is about finally learning from those who we have ignored and dismissed the longest. Biodiversity, fire management, climate adaptation, basic land use are all done better with traditional ecological knowledge. The Nature Conservancy, who manages over 100 million acres worldwide, is partnering with the Klamath tribe in Oregon to bring their knowledge into fire management, the benefits of which are vividly seen here in this photograph of the different results in land health when done with and without cultural burning by the tribe. Justice, equity, diversity, inclusion between people has always been essential to caring for the land long before this moment, but ever more important now. This is the time for my culture to work harder, building a practice of listening and moving at the speed of trust. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Forbes, and I'll thank all of you for your valuable testimony. And I remind the members that Committee Rule 3D also imposes a 5-minute limit on their questions. The chair will now recognize members for any questions they wish to ask. Let me begin by turning to the ranking member for his questions, comments. Mr. Westerman, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva, and thank you to the witnesses. I want to start with Delegate Freeland, and thank you so much for sharing your story with the committee today. It's actually very disheartening to hear how the views of the Navajo Nation were, quite frankly, just disregarded. As I said earlier, talk is cheap, and the Biden administration, they have a memorandum on tribal consultation and strengthening nation-to-nation relationship. And in part, it reads, quote, "My administration is committed to honoring tribal sovereignty and including tribal voices in policy deliberation that affects tribal communities," end quote. Delegate Freeland, in your opinion, did the Biden administration follow through on this commitment?
Mr. Chair, Ranking Member Westerman, thank you for that question. To date, we have not received a response as I stated in my testimony, so today would be no.
Well, can you detail the efforts that the Navajo Nation made to be included in the policy deliberation process? It wasn't like you all weren't trying to be included in the process, was it?
Thank you for that question. Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, we have made several attempts to work through our congressional delegation, and we have done this through the prior administration as well as this administration to have these voices heard. To date, we have not had a response to a letter we did send, like I mentioned in December, to the White House and to the Department of Interior.
So why do you think the Biden administration refused to engage you in this decision-making process? I mean, we've read their memorandum. We see the focus of this hearing today, yet you've experienced something different. Do you have any idea why they would act different than they speak?
Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Westerman, it all stems from the withdrawal of the acreage of the BLM lands. and that's going to make a severe impact on our Navajo Nation allottees. And I don't know if the administration or the Department of Interior completely understood or understands the potential impact this is going to cause to our Navajo people. And mind you that we do have about 20 to 25,000 of our Navajo people that will be impacted by this federal withdrawal of BLM lands.
Yeah,
Mr.
well, hopefully it is a misunderstanding, and I know you proposed having a field hearing. You know, I don't think anything tells the story any better than actually going to the field and seeing and hearing from the people who are actually being affected. You know, maybe the administration can reverse course and actually go out and talk to the people who this is affecting. That would be great, I think, if we could do a field hearing. It seems to me that the Biden administration has made just a unilateral decision without your input. However, Navajo families are the ones that are suffering from the consequences of this decision. Can you describe in more detail the adverse impacts of a ban on oil and gas development? What will be the day-to-day on-the-ground impacts to Navajo families?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chair and Ranking Member Westerman. Right now, like I mentioned before, we have 53 individual Indian allotments out there within that 10-mile buffer. And to date, that is going to impact about 20 to 25,000 of our Navajo Nation allottees out there. Now, they have that individual right to this process of energy and mineral extraction because that is their land through inheritance. Now, what's going to happen, of course, is that this impact will severely. They rely on these royalties for everyday needs, for food, for firewood, for propane, just for living, and you know that's going to make about a $6 million impact to them right now. And you know, in Navajo, we believe in customs, but there's always two sides to every story. And you know, one side has been heard now, but our side has yet to be heard. And you know, and the secretary did make a trip out there in November, and we were not consulted, or nor were we even invited. And we felt that was an insult to the nation and to nation's leadership. So that was hard to take. And as a member, excuse me, as a representative of that area, it falls within two of my chapter boundaries. So it is going to make a severe impact locally. Our people rely heavily on this income and these royalties that they receive. And they do have good relationships with the energy company. And I've seen this for myself. The oil companies do work with them directly. And you know, it's going to make a severe impact on them. So we ask that the committee please come out to Eastern Navajo Agency and hear from the people directly. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Delegate. You know, I couldn't help but think about when we look around the world today and we see what Putin's doing in Ukraine with amassing troops, basically on three sides of the country, and I'm disheartened to know that over $60 million a day of U.S. money is going to Russia to buy energy, and it seems like if we produce that energy domestically, maybe part of it off of the Navajo Nation, that would benefit families there on your reservation more than it's benefiting a ruthless person who's trying to do harm in the world. It just doesn't make sense to me why your voices weren't heard. And, you know, it's not just a temporary thing. My understanding is the Biden administration is pursuing a 20-year ban on oil and gas development around Chaco Canyon. I mean, that's part of your resources. What will you do? How will you generate income and jobs and, you know, allow communities to be built and families to grow without extracting these resources?
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Westerman, thank you for that question. Let me start by saying that the Navajo people have always been very patriotic to this country. And we have always called during a time of need, whether it's in the armed forces or across this country. We're very patriotic, and we still are to this day. Some of our young men and women were actually headed towards, you know, Eastern Europe. and have the call of duty. So we're very proud of them, and we're very acknowledgeable to our warriors out there serving this country in the military. So we're thankful for them. Um, as far as the energy extraction situation is concerned, right now, this 20-year moratorium for a 10-mile buffer is going to severely impact, I mentioned, the individual allotments. Energy companies are not going to want to go out there and just do one or two. They're going to want to do multiple allotments or multiple areas. And it's more cost effective that way. And, they don't want to go out there and just do one allotment. They want to do 3 or 4 at one time. And, it's going to make a severe impact financially on our Navajo people. And, all we're saying is hear our people out, give them some consideration, give them some time to be heard, and I as a representative, I feel really.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much. And thank you. And I'm sure the other members will, Mr. Freeland will allow, you'll be able to finish the thoughts. The time's gone over by a minute. We'll extend that courtesy to other witnesses as well once. And let me now turn to Chairman of the Subcommittee, Mr. Huffman, if you have any questions for the witness.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it is good to see that our colleagues across the aisle have suddenly found interest in tribal consultation. Certainly something that was missing whenever we considered any number of fossil fuel and mining projects in recent years, Keystone Pipeline, Dakota Access Pipeline. I mean, tribal concerns were nowhere on the map for our colleagues. But let us hope that this newfound concern is sincere and not just a pretext to advance the usual agenda of the fossil fuel and mining industries. I certainly hope that it is sincere. But Mr. Chairman, thank you for calling this hearing. Let me also say how proud I am of the way that you and Mr. McEachin in particular have worked so steadfastly to elevate the consideration of underserved and disadvantaged groups and communities of color in all of the work we do. This hearing is important and it has far-reaching implications. I have the pleasure of representing California's 2nd District, and of course it has many affluent, predominantly white communities, but it is rapidly diversifying and it is rich with indigenous culture. In fact, my district is home to more federally recognized tribal nations than any other congressional district in the lower 48. It is also home, as many of you know, to record-setting wildfires that are increasing in frequency and severity because of the climate crisis. And last August, I had the honor of hosting Secretary Deb Haaland on a tour of California's North Coast. She did something that no Secretary of Interior has ever done for the tribes in my district. She sat down with them. She listened to their concerns and ideas. And she also toured some areas where federal investments in tribal communities are creating opportunities and advancing both conservation and resiliency goals. Now, unsurprisingly, many of the tribal leaders that we spoke with highlighted the importance of forming partnerships with tribes and local stakeholders on environmental issues. I hear this a lot in my district and beyond. And we're starting to have some actual success stories on this front. Mr. Forbes, you mentioned toward the end of your testimony how the Nature Conservancy has partnered with the Klamath tribe in Oregon and helped improve forest health and fire resiliency. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on how incorporating indigenous leadership and traditional ecological knowledge in mainstream environmental institutions actually leads to better outcomes for everyone. And I'm particularly interested in hearing more about that wildfire example.
Thank you, Congressman Huffman. Yeah, I mean, despite our best intentions, there have been harmful practices like fire suppression, right? I mean, the knowledge that fire is essential to healthy land has always been there. We've simply ignored it. Decades of Western science, fire suppression led to the buildup of fuel. I think you know the story. Alternatively, there have been practices from traditional ecological knowledge around small-scale cultural burns done annually, reducing fuel loads, releasing seeds. But there's lots and lots of other examples of it. The UN came out with a report last year that said there's more biodiversity on indigenous managed land across the globe than on lands managed by Western science. Indigenous stewarded lands tend to produce more pollinators, more birds, more mammals. Those of us in agriculture, myself a farmer, there's so much that we can learn from Pueblo dryland farmers about how to produce healthy crops without diverting watersheds. There are as many examples, I think, of traditional ecological knowledge as there are diverse tribal nations themselves.
I appreciate that. So in your view, why is it so important that white environmentalists and policymakers show up on these issues? And what role do you think mainstream environmental NGOs should be playing in elevating and recentering indigenous perspectives?
Well, it's, I guess I want to say that the future doesn't necessarily mean white-led, right? I mean, white organization, white leaders who really care most about protecting the land need to care about that, not necessarily their role in it. I think white-led conservation groups need to re-examine their own origin stories to better understand what the myths are of those, what parts require repair with other people. I think that's really a very, very significant issue. Once you know the story of indigenous land loss, it's not hard to understand, for example, how the concepts of wilderness, quote unquote, untrammeled by man, can come close to being erasure of a people's experience. When there have been betrayals, we need to speak openly of them. We need to understand the treaties and really read them and understand what's still owed and never been fulfilled in those agreements. We need to contemplate what we can do through private ownership of land to restore what public treaties haven't done. That's what's happening in Maine, and we hope in Oregon as well.
It's over. We're almost done.
I think we need to vigorously support efforts to move toward the co-management of land. Those efforts grounded in our Department of the Interior and in indigenous nations. Finally, I'd say I think we, in the conservation environmental movement,
reached that minute threshold extension for you.
To build indigenous capacity to step into those roles. And I'm talking here about transferring some of our endowments directly to tribes to enable them to step into those roles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you. And we've extended the 1 minute courtesy, Mr. Forbes, that we extended to the other gentlemen. So hopefully that'll be the end of those. Let me now recognize Mr. McClintock for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I didn't do a mic check. Can you hear me?
I can hear you well.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, I guess I'd begin by raising the question why we're making any grants to any groups. These funds are often used as gigantic slush funds. They have little oversight, little follow-up, and little results except enriching the groups that receive them. If the federal government needs a particular good or service, it ought to send out a request for proposal, specify what it needs, and then award a contract to the lowest responsible bidder to provide that good or service, and then hold them contractually accountable for delivering that good or service, period. This entire discussion reminds me of the scene in Ghostbusters when a typical grant recipient is informed he might have to go work for the private sector. The private sector, he responds in horror, oh, no, I've worked for the private sector. They expect results. The entire discussion today underscores the principal purpose of these grants, to enrich the recipients. The majority doesn't argue this point. They just think it's enriching the wrong recipients based on their race. I think the American people have had enough of this nonsense. Let's stop throwing money at whatever group happens to be in political favor and start being as frugal with it as the families that actually earn that money are, after what they've got left after they've paid their taxes. Since the Biden administration took office and shut down energy exploration on federal lands and canceled the Keystone Pipeline and began a war on affordable energy, Americans' energy costs have skyrocketed. Anybody who's visited a gas station this year knows that. Anybody who's paid a utility bill knows that. The Democrats in Congress that they elected couldn't care less. And you've just proven that, I think, remarkably in this hearing. What they care about is that the taxes paid by American workers go to people based on their race, ethnicity, gender, political views, and sexual preferences. That's what the Democrats care about. This is absolutely insane. And it's going to continue as long as the people responsible for it remain in office. It is that simple. I yield back.
Huh? Mr. Lowenthal, you're recognized, sir. Let me now turn to, if he's available, Mr. Gallego, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it, and I apologize if I took Mr. Lowenthal's spot. I'm sure I'll make it up to him later. I want to thank all the witnesses for sharing your time and perspectives with the committee today. As a representative for the hottest district in the hottest city in the country, where the population is 62% Hispanic and 23% below the poverty line, the stakes of this conversation are sky high for the people I represent. The impacts of climate change and pollution are already being felt disproportionately by communities like mine. That means in order to effectively fight climate change and prevent the worst of its effects, we have to put these frontline communities front and center. That's why what we're doing here is very important. The perspectives and experiences of the groups that have most to lose from climate change, environmental justice, have been left out of policymaking for too long. I'm glad to work with you and the Biden administration to change that. Now, I just have a couple questions. Ms. Chatterjee, your testimony says that the mainstream environmental movement's history of exclusion has resulted in failed attempts at durable climate policy because policymakers have ignored the very people that have an organized community behind them. Why do you think it's critical for environmental NGOs to include affected communities in the decision-making process?
Thank you so much for your question. Back in 2009, the last time we had a large effort to pass climate legislation, it failed. One of the critical lessons that's been learned from many historians who've studied that effort is that the conversation on equity was not sufficient so that communities were bought into that effort. So from my perspective, it's imperative that we make sure that communities are included in the conversation so that policy can not only pass, but that it can be durable because it has the backing of communities like the ones you represent.
Great. And then in your testimony, you also mentioned that complex jargon and terminology is often used to hide real environmental dangers. I see this all the time in my community as well. Folks just may not understand the effects of certain chemicals or compounds, but they know dirtier air leads to asthma in our kids, even particulate. I think I remember seeing different permits, for different type of particulates, and the notification will go out. And of course, usually the hearings are during the day where many working class people, especially people of color, can't take time off to work. Can you also give some examples of how we can use plain language to combat this phenomenon?
Sure, thank you. I think that the way that we organize in our communities is with language that people understand. Language that you were just using. We know that our kids have asthma. We know that kids are missing school when they have asthma attacks. We know who is causing this. We know who the culprits are. We know that it comes from pollution. We know that that pollution has been perpetuated by billionaires in the oil and gas industry, insisting that their polluting profits be in our communities. So billionaires are making sure that our kids have asthma. I think that making sure that people understand these very, very simple real life effects, like not only of the immediate health effects, but also the effects of climate change. Why do we have more large wildfires? We have more large wildfires because of the same polluting billionaires who have kept this country addicted to a source of fuel that is literally poisoning our children. And I think using that plain language of we're poisoning our children, this is pollution, just helps people understand what's going on a lot better than using number and letter sequences.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Forbes. Mr. Forbes, you mentioned the Grand Canyon Trust is a strong example of Indigenous leadership. Can you please expand how you believe that Indigenous leadership has influenced and improved the group's work? and why incorporating the advice of affected communities is so important.
Thank you, Congressman. By having Indigenous board members, it changes the conversations that happen in those meetings. It brings the opportunity for new conversations, new policies, new ways of thinking into the most senior aspects of the organization. And that changes programs, it changes everything. And it's going to ultimately lead to decisions that are better for the Grand Canyon, better for that organization. I think also better for the Navajo people.
Thank you, Mr. Orb. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Gallegos, gentleman yields. Let me now and recognize and invite for his 5 minutes, Mr. Graves. Sir? If not, let me turn to and recognize Mr. Moore for his 5 minutes to question or comment with the witnesses. Sir, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delegate Freeland, I appreciate your comments and do share your frustration with the lack of consultation from this administration on management decisions. And in Utah, we have experienced this many times with federal unilateral land grabs and designations. It's frustrating to be in. It's frustrating to be a part of this whole entire conversation. I know my time in Congress has been short, but some of the things that I've valued the most, like I said, I'm from Utah. The Ute tribe is incredibly important to the entire heritage of our state. As I've spent a year in Congress, a little time leading up to my election in 2020, some of the things I look back on is my time meeting with the Ute committee, their governing body of individuals. I ran against the chairman of the Shoshone Nation in my general election. And you can go back and look at, I'm sure you're not all following Utah media, but the amount of collaboration and decency and civility that exists in Utah, it's frustrating to see a narrative get shifted into saying that my party or, doesn't care about this. These are very complex issues and we dig into it deeply. And the time and the amount of effort that I've spent working with the Ute tribe, some of the biggest highlights that I've had this year. One of the most exciting infrastructure projects in recent memory is currently actually unfolding in Utah. For the first time in decades, a new private rail line is being constructed to carry energy, agricultural, and manufacturing products across my district and into the larger rail network. We've spent countless hours on this, and it's been a huge success for this area. This development, it's funded entirely by private dollars, will create many high-paying jobs. It enjoys unanimous support from leaders in Utah, federal delegation, the legislature, governor's office, county leader, Senate minority leader, members of her leadership team, and more. But the most importantly, crucially, this project has the full and strong support and they're equity players in the Ute business and in the Ute Indian tribe. They rely on this part of the energy industry. And it's frustrating to watch environmental groups that I feel are being, with complete tunnel vision, with an outsized influence on some of the policy decisions that get made here that don't take into this reality into consideration. I'm going to try to yield a little bit of time back here, but Delegate Freeman, just a quick question that I would love your response to is, why is it so important to include local voices like those of the Navajo Nation in decision making? And why we just can't rely on bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. or those that have outsized influence over policy to make decisions for us.
Mr. Chair and Congressman, thank you for that question. Collectively, the Navajo Nation leadership is equally concerned, that environmental organizations have pointed a target on Chaco Canyon, for instance, whether it's political or financial gain, without listening or taking into account the people that are from that very region. Now, the Chaco area is located on Navajo lands, and as leaders, we have to come to an understanding that this is a part of the protection that came from, or the discussion that came from, the National Parks Conservation Association. They've been one of the primary environmental advocacy groups for national parks. and for the years have launched campaigns calling for buffers around 12 national parks are most threatened by oil and gas, and Chaco was one of them. And the last 6 years have been there have been multiple proposals and considerations, but that's a concern without taking any consideration of the potential impacts to our people as well. So no consideration was given to our people at any level. Thank you.
Delegate. Chairman, I'd like to yield 1 minute of my time to Ranking Member Westerman.
Thank you, Representative Moore. And Mr. Forbes, you brought up a point that I think we have a lot of agreement on when you talk about how tribes manage forests. I had the great pleasure last summer to be out in South Central New Mexico and visit the Mescalero Apache tribe. I met Thora Padilla, who's a forester there. I studied forestry myself. I'm telling you, they were managing this ponderosa pine forest textbook style. It was almost perfect. We went up to the Lincoln National Forest where the Little Bear Fire burned 44,000 acres 12 years ago. Looked like a moonscape. I think that the tribes manage because they can. The Forest Service doesn't manage because they're prevented. Do you have an opinion on that?
If you can make your response pretty quick, because the 5 minutes have already expired. Thank you.
I would simply say I agree with you, Congressman, and I think every opportunity we have to integrate Indigenous voice into management and follow that lead is really important. And to Delegate Freeland, I agree with much that you've said, and all the environmental organizations I know and work with have a great deal of respect for the Navajo Nation.
Thank
And
Gentleman yields. Let me now. And on that topic, if I may, Mr. Westerman and Mr. Freeland and Mr. Forbes that had just commented on it. On that topic, this committee will have in the near future, in the very near future, the opportunity to talk about codifying consultation as a process for Indian country. We will have an opportunity to do that and to talk about this general consensus that we seem to be arriving at. And then the other thing, we'll also have an opportunity to deal to codify some of the protections for all communities, particularly impacted and marginalized communities, relative to the issue of environmental justice and participation in that decision making under NEPA. And so we'll have an opportunity to deal with co-management initiatives legislatively going forward with regard to Indigenous people and tribes. And so we'll have that opportunity to begin to look at it legislatively and codify it. And so those are being expedited now and should be before us and for your input in the very, very near future. With that, now let me now turn to the chair of the subcommittee, Ms. Ledger Fernandez. Madam Representative, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Chair Grijalva, and thank you for leading the effort to have this conversation about the importance of consultation that, together with preservation and recognition of the many stories and ties to the land that people have, that the Indigenous wisdom that must be brought to fore as we talk about all these issues, the voices that must be heard, but also the voices from around the country, from different people's ties, whether it's Latinos who've also been living on the land for a long time, who must also respect the Indigenous place. That is part and parcel of who we are, and the work that I am so glad we are able to do in the Subcommittee on Indigenous Peoples. So I really appreciate all the witnesses' testimony adding to that narrative. And thank you so much, Delegate Freeland, for your tireless advocacy. I really appreciated the meeting that we had here in my office last week. I appreciated, as you know, we spoke about it last week, but when we were planning the meeting that we had with the allottees, where you brought allottees and the speakers, the Navajo Speaker's Office, and you and other delegates together last spring. It's when we did that. So last spring, I really appreciated that. And as you know, I and as we talked about it last week, about the importance of listening as an ongoing act, as an ongoing process, and listening with both an open mind and an open heart. So I join you, the Navajo and the Pueblo leaders, in striving to find that important balance, that important harmony that we must always look for in protecting the priceless cultural resources of Chaco Canyon, of the mineral rights, of the Atlantes, of so many of these other places. You know, I really enjoyed when I was able to work in New Mexico a bit on that protection of Mount Taylor, which is also one of those places that is sacred and protected for so many different tribes, the Navajo and the Pueblos and the Zunis. And, you know, that collaboration that existed there and that discussion, I think, is really important. But we also know that protecting cultural properties requires significant investment of tribal resources that you don't always have. It takes money to hire the staff. You have an amazing staff there, and your tribal, your TIPO. So that's why I led the inclusion of additional funding in the House passed appropriations bill for cultural studies. I also introduced a bill just last week that would dedicate increased resources to the Historic Preservation Fund, which will help fund your TIPO office and all other TIPO offices and state offices. So a common theme that I think we've heard today that the Chair Grijalva recognized is the need for Latino, Native American, and other underrepresented voices to access funding opportunities. So, you know, I know what that's like because I've spent my lifetime representing tribes, representing northern New Mexico, and I know how hard it is to access that federal funding. And that there's these additional challenges that rural communities face, from the lack of broadband to be able to get those funding. We're going to be trying to work on a lot of that through the infrastructure bill, but I want to take it down to sort of what could we do better? So Ms. Chatterjee, in your testimony, you discussed the need to lower the barriers for underrepresented organizations to apply for grants. What are the changes you think could make it easier for organizations and communities to apply and manage those grants while still maintaining, you know, people are worried about the maintaining oversight. How do you think, what would you recommend to us, both for foundations and for federal governments?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Hernandez. I think that one of the big things is making the application process less complex. We know that for small grassroots organizations, spending hours and hours and hours is impossible to do. And is really burdensome. I also think that giving multi-year support becomes really important so that groups have the flexibility to assess and determine how to achieve justice within their own communities, repair past harms, and prevent future harms. If you want to, for example, hire somebody to do the work, you really have to understand that you have resources for a few years. And then, of course, just seeking out conversations to understand, you know, what has happened in those grants, as opposed to having like very, very onerous reporting requirements. I think that changing these requirements will actually increase the standard and the work that is getting done.
Thank you, and I see my time has expired. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Let me return to Mr. Graves. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank
Hope y'all are having a great day today. I want to thank the witnesses for coming and testifying. Ms. Chatterjee, I could certainly point out a number of things in your testimony I don't agree with, but one thing I perhaps want to highlight that I think I do agree with is that you made comments about the lengthy process and the bureaucracy associated with grant making, and to some degree, I think you covered kind of the black box process, the lack of transparency, and I do want to make note that I do think that there are improvements that we can make there in terms of improving transparency in decisions, in terms of ensuring that the right criteria is being used to award grants for the best outcomes. And in many cases, from what we've seen, I think that grants are focused more so on, and federal decision making is based more so on protecting themselves from litigation versus doing what the actual grants or the regulatory decisions are supposed to be achieving. Is that a fair assessment and maybe an area where we can agree?
Thank you so much for the question. Absolutely. I think that the grant process is onerous. I think there are examples even within the federal government of it working well. I think there are examples within the federal government of using peer review processes. And then there are examples where sometimes we have members who've told us that they had to write a 100-page proposal, for example, for a body of work that they were clearly very well suited to do. But writing 100 pages is practically a novel. That can't be the expectation. And if that is the expectation, what will happen is that legacy recipients are the only ones who will be able to receive the contracts and grants from the federal government because they have full-time staff who are there to write those proposals. And so I think it is a point of agreement, and hopefully we could find others as well.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I know the chairman's told me that he used to just copy cliff notes in encyclopedias rather than in school, rather than writing 100 pages worth of reports and documents, right, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Freeland, I want to flip over to you for just a minute. I'm a believer that all people, regardless of race or color, origin, should be treated fairly, and I think it's important. I'm concerned that some of the layering of decision making, and non-statutory criteria, meaning public policy that is brought into decisions that may not be in the law, or in some cases, I think, are inconsistent with the law, can result in distorting or manipulating outcomes that may not be in taxpayers' interest. And I think that in some cases, these criteria are preventing the best decisions, or preventing appropriate fairness or treatment of individuals that may be of diverse backgrounds. And I think in many cases, the environmental review process has been expanded beyond its intent of actually focusing on the environmental impacts and protecting an environment. And I think it's been weaponized as a tool to, in some cases, justify policy outcomes. The series of decisions for whether to designate a buffer zone around Chaco Canyon National Park, I think, is a good example of just that. And how the administration, in my opinion, fundamentally misunderstands or maybe even disregards the impact of resource development, particularly on economically disadvantaged communities. Although Alati lands are not officially prevented from resource development, can you expand on how the buffer designation impacts the interest for developers and hinders economic operations, and how this is impacting tribal Alatis?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Congressman. Thank you for that question. First and foremost, this is an issue for our Navajo people. This is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is a Navajo people, Alati right issue. First and foremost, let's make that very clear. We are here to ask for tribal consultation on our side. You know, tribal consultation has been conducted to other tribes, yes. We do have strong cultural ties to the area. A lot of our people live in that area. And to create a 10-mile buffer zone would severely impact, you know, financially, the Alatis that live within that area, that have those mineral rights, that do have that individual Indian allotment right. You know, financially, they do rely on that. You know, recently there was a published in the Federal Register, you know, the BLM to be with land to be withdrawn. There's going to be a public hearing that's going to be held. It's not even going to be held in the Navajo Nation. It's going to be held in Farmington. You know, these communities are going to be severely impacted by this withdrawal, and it's so important that we just ask for a consultation adequately to have our people be heard. Our people cannot travel to Washington, D.C. to visit the congressmen and the senators. You know, they cannot. So we're their only voice. And like I told one of our congresswomen, we're here to share our stories. We're here to share their thoughts and their concerns with you all. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freeland. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, yield back.
The gentleman yields. Let me now turn to Ms. Stanberry for your 5 minutes. You're recognized, Representative.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. And I want to take this opportunity to thank all of our witnesses this morning for participating in this important hearing. I think it's really crucial that we acknowledge the history of the United States and its policies and how that has disproportionately impacted our communities of color, and in particular, our Indigenous, Black, Brown, and other communities that have been affected by the historical policies of this country and economic development, and in particular, our Indigenous communities, and the ways in which that history has impacted and led to the loss of lands and waters, has had disproportionate impacts from resource extraction and pollution in our Indigenous, Hispanic, Black, and AAPI communities, and impacted the ability of these communities to not only have their voices heard, but to have a meaningful seat at the table in developing the policies that affect our communities and their ability to change the course of their own futures. In New Mexico, our Indigenous communities have managed lands and waters for generations since time immemorial. In fact, the land, water, and agricultural stewardship practices of our tribes and pueblos have been in existence for thousands of years, and our tribes and pueblos continue to be at the forefront of land and water stewardship. Pueblos in the middle Rio Grande, such as Sandia, Isleta, and Santa Ana, are working to restore the bosque and ensure water is available for generations to come. Pueblos such as Kiwa, Cochiti, Jemez, and Santa Clara have been at the forefront of restoring our forests, managing for fires, and working to improve the hydrology and resilience of our lands and waters. Our tribes and pueblos are working to address the impacts of climate change, to maintain and revitalize our traditional agricultural practices, to restore and to repatriate sacred lands and traditional lands, and to continue those traditional stewardship practices that are central to the cultures and traditions and ways of life of our communities. And New Mexico is also home to other models of land and water stewardship that have sustained our communities for generations. Our land grant and acequia communities have sustainably managed land and water for generations. My hermana from the north, Representative Ledger Fernandez, knows the importance of these land grants and acequias, which are steeped in our Hispano-Latino heritage in New Mexico, and which carry traditions that are key to the future resilience of our state and our communities. So as the federal government is intersecting with and working with our communities to promote conservation and resource stewardship, we have to make sure that our communities are centered in that work and that there is adequate funding and support for co-management, for working together and ensuring that our communities' histories, cultures, languages are really centered in the work that we are trying to advance. So that means providing funding, resources, supporting co-management of lands and waters, meaningful consultation, and of course, recognizing the tribal sovereignty of our pueblos and tribes, and most importantly, ensuring that the knowledge, the wisdom, the governance, the institutions of our communities and communities of color are really at the center of our conservation and environmental protection work. So I want to thank the chair for convening today's hearing. And I'd like to ask a question of Ms. Chatterjee. You know, I think one of the reasons why we're having this hearing is to really understand how our communities can meaningfully be at the table in this work. So I wonder if you could take a few moments to talk about what you see as the primary barriers to advancing true justice, equity, diversity, and belonging in our mainstream environmental and conservation work, and how do we bring all of these voices to the table in our work in a meaningful way?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Hansberry. I think I spoke about one of the barriers, which is jargon, but I think that one thing I just want to make sure to be clear here is that, you know, part of the issue here is that we don't have any time on the climate crisis, and we spent so much time prioritizing voices of people who are not impacted, that the core of this is that we've got to we are out of time to waste. And so we've got to fix that core problem, which is bringing in the voices of the people who are most affected.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I see I'm out of time here. So with that, I'll yield back, and thank you so much for holding this important hearing today.
Thank you. Thank you for your comments. Let me recognize Representative Stauber. You're recognized, sir. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Freeland, I agree with you that Interior Secretary Howland has been a disappointment, to say the least. The Interior Secretary pulled 2 federal leases from a mining operation before it was even allowed to go through the review process, the process that we have in place. It was purely political. So your disappointment in the Secretary is felt by many, including those union miners in northern Minnesota. Ms. Chatterjee, thank you for being here. And Ms. Chatterjee, the Climate Action Network, that's a nonprofit, is that correct?
That's correct, Congressman.
And what is your salary?
I do not know my salary off the top of my head, but it is fully disclosed in our 990 tax forms.
Would $164,000 be correct?
That sounds approximately correct.
And it's and you're out of Washington, D.C.?
That is correct.
What's the median income in Washington, D.C.?
I also do not know the median income in Washington, D.C. off the top of my head.
Okay, it's 92,000. Ms. Chatterjee, I noticed that the Climate Action Network has a Chinese branch called the China Youth Climate Action Network. Is my camera on?
Yes, I can see you.
Okay, thank you. So I noticed that the Climate Action Network has a Chinese branch called the China Youth Climate Action Network. Does the China Youth Climate Action Network support the justice of Uyghur minorities that are tortured and killed by the Chinese Communist Party?
U.S. Climate Action Network is a node of an international network of climate activists called Climate Action Network International. So we are the U.S. node. We have about 200 member organizations in the U.S. and there
are you doing anything about the Uyghurs being tortured and killed by the Chinese Communist Party via your Chinese Youth Climate Action Network? Are you engaged with them at all?
So thank you for the question. The U.S. Climate Action Network is a node of the International Climate Action Network, which has 20 nodes around the world. Each of the nodes, it operates independently, and we are all committed to justice at the core of our work.
And have you done anything about the Uyghurs being tortured and killed by the Chinese Communist Party since you have a connection with the Chinese Youth Climate Action Network? Have you done anything?
Our work in the United States is focused specifically on the U.S. federal government and the need to pay attention to the climate crisis and center equity and justice in that work.
What I'm hearing you saying,
nodes of Climate Action
Chatterjee, what I'm hearing you saying is your Climate Action Network in the United States has not done anything with the Youth Climate Action Network in China reference to Uyghurs.
Our work is focused on the U.S. federal government and U.S. policies that are put forward by the U.S. federal government, as well as organizing in our own communities around the United States. We do engage in ensuring that just policies are put forward.
But you haven't. Yeah, I just want to make it clear you haven't engaged in the Uyghur issue being tortured and killed. Is that correct? With the Climate Action Network, the Youth Climate Action Network, you haven't done anything with that. So is the Climate Action Network aware of child slave labor in Chinese-owned cobalt mines in the Congo?
Thank you for the question. Our work is explicitly to make sure that we have a just transition off of fossil fuels so that we can address the climate crisis.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you saying is your climate
standards.
Excuse me, it's my time. It's short time, so I just want to be brief here. Your Climate Action Network has done nothing about the Chinese cobalt mines in the Congo where they are forcing child slave labor to mine cobalt. Is that correct?
Well, the work that we have done within the United States, for example, is to put forward really strong labor standards within federal policy, which we think is critically important for us to achieve a just transition off of fossil fuels, but also secure, thriving communities where people have decent work.
So it doesn't appear that you're doing anything for the justice of those children forced in the Congo to mine cobalt for our green economy. Is that correct?
Well, for example, there are pieces of legislation like the Thrive Agreement that has in place labor standards that we have fought very hard for. Labor bills such as the PRO Act are core to what we put forward as a climate network to make sure that we are promoting policies where people can work with dignity, but
Ms.
where
Chatterjee,
we also
yeah,
are solving the climate crisis.
time is brief. So Ms. Chatterjee, you do not support the United States of America purchasing cobalt that was mined with child slave labor, do you?
Thank you for the question. Our views are around labor are very clear that we believe that everyone should be paid for their work, that everybody should have a decent living, and that everyone
So
has
what's
a
your
right
answer to my
form a
question?
union.
What is your answer to my question? Do you believe the United States should purchase copper from foreign countries that use child slave labor to mine?
We're 1 minute over, and
Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield 2 minutes of my time to Congressman Stopper.
Thank you very much. So, Ms. Chatterjee,
when your time arrives, Ms. Harrell, you can do exactly that. We're going back and forth, so I would be sequencing Ms. Velasquez next, but you will be after that, and I would be glad to respect that yield. With that, let me now ask Representative Velasquez she's recognized for 5 minutes for any comments and questions she may have. Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing. I would like to address my first question to Mr. Forbes. In your testimony, you cited a report card that found 99% of NGOs have resources set aside to finance JD efforts. Yet the majority do not have substantial ways of elevating the voices of Black, Indigenous and Brown communities. Can you identify one strategy you believe, if implemented, will help NGOs do a better job of ensuring marginalized voices at all levels are heard?
Thank you, Congressman. It's a really, really important question. And while that report card is true, it doesn't speak to all the other organizations that are trying really hard to make a difference. I think the number way to do that is to create space for BIPOC leadership in senior staff and on boards. And that takes nothing more than the commitment to do that, and then creating the pathways for those individuals to succeed and to share their vision for the
I think it's a very important issue because after all, when it comes to Indigenous, Black, Brown communities, they bear the brunt of environmental injustice in this country. So it is important that when we look at solutions and how to address climate change, that they must be at the table in positions that will help shape public policy. Mr. Forbes, can you discuss the dangers of not having a powerful voice from these communities in environmental organizations? How would that affect conservation efforts and sustainabilities of those communities?
Well, thank you. I mean, the number one answer is irrelevance. I mean, without bringing in BIPOC leadership and voice, environmental conservation organizations risk becoming irrelevant. They are not able to understand the issues that our country is experiencing today and to move forward in a way that represents those issues and connects people to the land in a much more holistic way. So this is really an existential question for the environmental movement.
Thank you. Mr. Dossunmu, BIPOC-led groups are an essential part of the fight to combat climate change because they disproportionately bear the burden of environmental racism. Your organization's Climate Funders Justice Pledge is a step in the right direction. Besides having climate funders take the pledge, are there other ways the Donors of Color Network plans to hold funders accountable long-term?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question, Congresswoman. We start from the proposition that the communities that are closest to the crisis are closest to the solutions. So that is really the animating idea behind the work that we do at the campaign. As you've already mentioned, one of the core tenets of the campaign is this commitment to get to 30% resourcing of BIPOC-led organizations over the course of 2 years. So the funders that sign on to the campaign make that pledge and that commitment. So we are working to create a baseline, a floor of eventually tens of millions of dollars going to BIPOC-led organizations. But the other way that we are contributing to the solution here is really through transparency. On the idea that sunlight is the best disinfectant, that if funders are publicly accountable for where their dollars are going, that creates an opportunity for communities to hold those funders accountable to the pledges that many of them have already made. One of the motivating ideas behind the campaign, which is about a year old, is that the public statements around justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion were not actually being reflected in the funding. And so what we've done is really create a transparency opportunity.
Thank you. Ms. Chatterjee, can you please discuss what success looked like for your organization and how you are internally measuring the success of your grant program?
Thank you so much. We are internally measuring the success of our grant program by talking to our grantees and our communities and understanding whether they are able to use the resources in order to advance climate action that puts racial justice and economic justice at the heart of their work.
Do you, for example, request input from those communities about how to improve your grant program?
We do, yes. We have an adaptive process, and we actually have the people who are giving the grants out are the recipients. So if there's a recipient group that is not up for a renewal in 1 year, they become part of the decision-making process on a regular basis. And this has been iterative over the course of 7 years. And so we've consistently adapted so that we're making sure that we're having the most impact on the communities in the ground where people need immediate help.
Thank you very much.
I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Let me now turn to gentlelady from New Mexico, Ms. Harrell. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and thank you for your patience.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses. Great information. I want to be brief because I would like to yield a couple of minutes back over to my colleague, Congressman Stauber. But Delegate Freeland, thank you so much for your time last week when we met and had these discussions. And I just want clarity on something. In your opening statement, you mentioned, I thought you said an ethnic graphic studies. I might have gotten that just a little bit wrong. But I also know there's a congressional commissioned cultural resource investigation. Are those one and the same, or is that two separate? I'm just looking for clarity.
Those are the same,
Okay.
the same idea or the same investigation. Thank you, Congresswoman. Good morning.
You're welcome. Thank you. Hi. And I agree with, until we have all the information necessary to make these decisions, and certainly input from everybody who's going to be impacted, I think we are somewhat putting the cart before the horse with making these decisions. And I absolutely support the idea of a tribal consultation. And I really support the idea of having a field hearing where we can really sit down and discuss what is happening with the allottees and how this impacts development in terms of economic development, personal prosperity, and other things. So I do have a question very quickly for Mr., and I hope I say your name correctly, Mr. Dossunmu. Do I say it right?
Yes, you do.
Great. I'm just curious, is there room, or had before this 20-mile barrier buffer was put into play, was there any conversation between your organization and the Navajo Nation And if not, is that something that your organization would be willing to do, is facilitate a meeting so that we can ensure that we're having the correct conversation with all the interested stakeholders?
Well, I'm actually not familiar with our engagement on that particular issue,
Okay.
but I will say that consultation is a core tenet of the work that we do. It is essentially the animating idea, and we work very, very closely with movement allies and movement partners across the country to make sure their voices are amplified in the federal policymaking process. So I can't speak directly to the issue that you've raised,
Sure.
but I can tell you that we are committed in the main to consultation and engagement as a core tenet of our work.
Okay, thank you. And just a quick comment from Mr. Forbes. I appreciate your comment about forest management on tribal lands and reservations as opposed to some of our public spaces, because there is a night and day difference. And Mr. Chair, with that, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to Congressman Stauber. And thank you so much.
Gentlelady yields. Mr. Stauber, you're recognized for about 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to Ms. Chatterjee. Ms. Chatterjee, as the Executive Director of U.S. Climate Action Network, and by your previous admission, why aren't you supporting labor protections for the Uyghurs?
We do support labor protections within U.S. law. Our focus is on U.S. policy as the U.S. Climate Action Network. An example of that is labor provisions that we put forward in the Thrive Act, which
Okay, but I
really
specifically
important to
asked
us.
about the Uyghurs. I specifically asked about the Uyghurs. Can you tell me something concrete with reference to labor protections for the Uyghurs?
Our work
Yes
is
or no?
focused on the U.S. federal government, and so our work on making sure that there are strong labor standards in place that protect that protect the right of workers to unionize and the rights of workers more broadly.
Okay, so
are
it
within
sounds like
context
you,
of U.S.
as the
federal
executive director,
government and
excuse
U.S.
me,
state
this is my
government.
time. We have to be brief here. It sounds like you have done no labor protections for the Uyghurs. And then my last question: should the United States government purchase cobalt and other critical minerals that have been mined in foreign countries by child slave labor?
It is horrific to enslave a human being. And that is a completely unacceptable practice, and sadly is also the history of this very nation. A history where we started enslaving
as a
human
nation,
beings.
Ms. Chatterjee, I have just a brief amount of time, yes or no? Should the United States purchase critical minerals or rare earth minerals, cobalt, et cetera, from Chinese-owned mines that are forcing children to mine these using slave labor? That's a yes or a no. It's
No,
not that.
there are no circumstances where enslaving other human beings is at all acceptable.
So your answer is a no. Is that correct? We should not purchase these minerals. Okay. Is that anywhere on your Climate Action Network resume that we should not be purchasing? Because we have the ability to mine these minerals here.
Gentleman's time is expired.
Standards, best labor standards. And I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, despite the yield. Let me now turn to Representative Levin for his 5 minutes, and you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding today's hearing. I think it's an important one as we evaluate ongoing efforts to improve justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives at NGOs and grant-making organizations. Promoting JEDI is not only the right thing to do, but we also know it leads to better outcomes. Last year, the National Academy has released a report arguing that advancing JEDI is central to federal efforts seeking to create better environmental, economic, and public health outcomes for everyone. It's also clear we need to address JEDI priorities, especially as we seek to meet the moment and rapidly decarbonize our society. So as we make federal investments to address climate change, it's also clear we need to center our efforts in the principles of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion if we truly want to create durable policies that'll lead to better outcomes. Ms. Chatterjee, I appreciated in your testimony the discussion of how improving diversity within the workplace and in federal policy making isn't enough to build equity and further environmentally just policies. Providing greater access to members of historically marginalized communities doesn't automatically lead to greater influence or the advancement of equitable and just environmental policies. So based on your personal experience working at a mainstream environmental organization and in aiding other organizations in addressing JEDI, do you believe that efforts to address JEDI at environmental NGOs result in better outcomes in federal policymaking?
Thank you so much for your question. I do believe it results in better outcomes. And we know that the converse has resulted in incredibly harmful outcomes. And so if you just look at the state of where there are communities that have more asthma, we know that Black people are 3 times more likely to die from asthma. I could continue to give examples about lead, about cancer, et cetera. But the reality is that communities that are currently vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and to the impacts of pollution were made vulnerable through policy. It is not a coincidence. And so it is only policy that can undo it. So we know what happens when we don't include people in decisions. When we do include people in decisions, we can actually repair those harms. It's an incredible opportunity at a time when we are out of time to address the climate crisis, and so have to make these massive investments in our infrastructure anyway. So we should do so in a way that repairs the harms that have come from policy.
On what you just said, can you share how federal policy conversations can be structured to maximize equity and inclusivity among all stakeholders, and specifically how we can ensure that those whose communities are most impacted by policies aren't just offered a seat at the table, but are able to actually have influence over that policy?
Thank you. I think that there's a number of ways for this to happen. I think some of it starts with the work that we've been talking about, of making sure that different groups are around the table. That in and of itself isn't enough. I think we actually need to prioritize those voices in a different way. So some of the practices we do every day are we use something called progressive stack. So you're in a room full of stakeholders. Some of them come from large environmental organizations. Some of them come from grassroots organizations that are directly affected on the ground by a facility. In a progressive stack, no matter who raises their hand first, you would always go to the person who's directly affected at the beginning. And there are a few other practices like this, but these practices we found over time, we iterate them, we adapt them, we find that they give voice to the people who are most impacted over time, which is the ultimate goal. So it's not that we have the immediate solution, it's that what we can tell you is that if you continue to adapt and then ask questions, find out, were you listened to in that experience? Did the policy turn out in a way that improved your community's outcomes? And if not, why not? Why were there still harmful polluting facilities at the end if you were truly listened to? Continuing to adapt and making sure policy is responsive is critically important.
Thank you. With the time I have, I'll turn to you, Mr. Dossunmu. You noted a New School study that found only 1.3% of the $1.34 billion awarded by 12 national environmental funders goes to people of color-led, justice-focused groups. And you called it a moral failing and an ineffective and losing strategy. Why do you think we need to improve? Obviously, we need to improve that number, but why do you think that's so important as we consider tackling climate change?
Thank you so much, Congressman. And in the time you have, I'll just very quickly say that we're not currently resourcing the best, most transformative solutions. And we're losing the opportunity to put some of our most thoughtful thinkers and advocates and players on the field. And so if you look at what BIPOC-led organizations and BIPOC leaders are doing, is they're radically imagining a new world. They're radically imagining just transitions. They're thinking about the intersection of the environment with other policy issues, and they're bringing new solutions to the table. Resourcing those groups will only further empower that critical work.
I'm over time, but I appreciate the thoughtful discussion, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields. Thank you very much. And now let me, seeing that there's no Republican colleagues to turn to, Mr. Ranking Member, I'm going to proceed with the members that are on the list. Ms. Representative Tonko, you are recognized for 5 minutes, sir. Thanks, sir. Let me move to Representative Brownlee. The gentlelady is recognized for any questions she might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and really thank you for holding this hearing. So I think, I wanted to ask a question of Ms. Chatterjee. And first, I would just say that, cultural change is really hard within an organization. And I know you know this, but it must be intentional, razor focused, and it must persist and build every year, year after year. And cultural change in the federal government, I think, is probably the hardest one of all. I mean, just think about the simple example we've used today about jargon. I mean, we're using it in this hearing. Was somebody just tuned in and we were talking about Jedi? Are we talking about, Star Wars? Or are we talking about justice, equity, diversity, or inclusion? So it's an simple example, but culture change is really, really hard. And you can't change culture without measuring, progress and where you're going to go. So I think you've hit upon this, somewhat, but I wanted to ask the question, how do we measure justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion when we're talking about philanthropy, federal government, state government? I know we've mentioned sunshine and transparency. Are there other variables for measurement?
Thank you so much for the question. Of these issues we're talking about, diversity is the relatively easy one to measure, right? Like either you have diversity or you don't have diversity, and I think that is important to measure. I think that then there are metrics you can start to look at around inclusion, around justice, around equity. We obviously ask those questions around race and gender and ability to make sure we have people in the room. But then we're also constantly asking questions about are we giving voice to the right people? Is the outcome of our work viewed favorably by those who have previously been excluded? I think a lot of it, again, as I said earlier, is iterative, but a lot of it is systematizing that learning. So making sure that in every meeting, you have that checklist of questions you're asking. In every meeting, you're asking an evaluative question at the end, like, how do we do in this meeting? And how do we do in this process? How do we do in this project? And continuing to change over time. I think really the beginning of it is making clear what your goals are, and then measuring yourself against it, and making sure that it is really, as you say, incorporated into the leadership and the culture of the organization.
Thank you for that. And this question is really to any of the witnesses. We've briefly mentioned just transition, and just transition certainly comes up in a lot of our conversations, and critically important piece of environmental policy. And so, we know we need to do it, but so far we're not able to cite that many examples of just transition. And I'm just curious from any of the witnesses if you can point me to a couple of good examples around just transition.
Well, one thing I will say is that we work very, very closely with a number of movement leaders and movement allies across the country that are very active on that very question. So in particular, the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, which has been doing a lot of really innovative thinking in the Gulf South around a Green New Deal for the Gulf South, thinking about how jobs and housing and transportation and healthcare intersect with the environment and the climate crisis, and how we can leverage kind of a movement around justice to address all of those issues. I think, again, it goes to this idea that those who are closest to the challenges are closest to the solutions, and lifting up the folks who are doing the really innovative work to light the path forward for us.
Thank you. I see my time is up. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for your questions. And is there, Mr. Westerman, is there a member on your side of the aisle that we can keep this alternating rotation going? Is there a member that wishes to be recognized that has not been recognized? If not, let me now turn to Mr. Representative Tanco. Sir, you're recognized. I know you. Huh? Let me go to Mr. Tanco, you're recognized for 5 minutes. I know you were having some difficulties with the connection. Now let me recognize, until we get that figured out, let me recognize Representative Dingle for 5 minutes. You're recognized, Representative.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening today's hearing. This is such an important topic. Across our country, the loss of nature and environmental destruction has disproportionately affected low-income communities of color. In fact, communities of color are 3 times more likely to live in nature-deprived areas, and more than 76% of low-income communities of color are located in nature-deprived areas. We also know that inequitable access to nature's benefits has causal and correlated relationships to disparities in public health, economic prosperity, and vulnerability to the effects of climate change. My colleague Rashida Tlaib and I, who's on this committee as well, have some areas that abut each other that we work very hard together on this issue. So, Ms. Chatterjee and Mr. Forbes, I'm going to ask you, what advice do you have for environmental NGOs for accountability measures to ensure the communities of color, Indigenous peoples, and low-income communities are receiving an equitable share of federal and philanthropic conservation investments? And how can NGOs use accountability to increase equitable access to nature's benefits? Whichever one of you wants to go first. Mr. Forbes?
Forbes.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Well said. I think there are many steps to accountability, right? I mean, one is stating publicly why these organizations are doing the work so that the rest of the community can hold them accountable to that. I think another measure of accountability is how they're actually using their money. Is it going into underserved communities? You know, who is actually benefiting from the work that they're doing? I think how they use their endowments matters at this critical moment. Is it more important to be around for 100 years or to use the next 5 years to move the needle? Another critical part of accountability, I think, is representation. You know, are sufficient people of color, 50%, 60% on staffs and boards?
Ms. Chatterjee?
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that, agree with all of that, and say that I think there has to be a genuine willingness to share power and therefore to give up power, and make sure that other voices get to be heard within conversations. You know, I think that Mr. Forbes raised previously that a lot of the origin stories of large environmental organizations, you know, come from, you know, royalty, you know, colonialists, people who actually stole land. And I think that there needs to be a willingness to address the history of the organization, but also a willingness to give up power, whether that comes in the form of time, money, access. If we want to win, it's in service of justice. It's in service of equity that we ask our fellow leaders to bring others into the conversation and bring others into the room where decisions are being made.
So thank you for that. Over the past year, we've seen an increase in financial and human resource commitments towards justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. but there's a lack of data indicating progress.
Video back there.
Somebody, sorry.
Okay.
For nonprofit fundraisers, the lack of diversity in donor bases, fundraising teams, and leadership at the top often leaves organizations without a clear path to achieve equity. This is a personal, before I came to the Congress, was president of a foundation and was on many boards. And this accountability and this lack of data is a real issue as we measure this going forward. And we're going to run out of time, but what guidance, and maybe you can do this for the record, do you have for environmental nonprofits and funders to better identify and measure the kinds of investments that would improve the ability of communities of color and historically marginalized communities to advance public policy? Maybe quickly, you both could, Mr. Chatterjee and Mr. Dossunmu could answer that, but you've got 12 seconds. So maybe we have Mr. Dossunmu do it because he didn't speak before.
I'll do it very quickly and just say that one of the ways that we do this is actually by prompting them to do the data analysis. So one of the things that we found when we started our work is that a number of funders really had not thought to do that kind of analysis. So we've actually been working in partnership with funders and with the data community to innovate solutions around the data capture, the data collection, and the data analysis so that funders can actually do it. But it started with us actually asking them for the data and the information. And that's something that you all can help with in a big way.
I want to continue to work with all of you. I'm out of time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back, but I would like to stay close to the three of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentlelady yields, and let me recognize Commissioner Gonzalez Colon for 5 minutes. Commissioner, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to say thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. My question will be to Delegate Freeland. How can you elaborate on some of your concerns with the administration decision regarding to the buffer zone around the Chaco Canyon, particularly with respect to the formal tribal consultation? And my second question will be, do you understand that how that decision to withdraw these areas around the canyon may impact the Navajo Nation's economic well-being? I don't know if the delegate is speaking.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I muted myself. Good morning, Congresswoman. Thank you for the question from New Mexico. Good morning. Thank you for the question at hand related to the impacts or the potential impacts that this could cause related to the buffer zone. The proposed buffer zone was, I understand, was started at a 20-mile discussion and was later reduced down to 10. The Navajo Nation did seek a compromise just to have our people be heard. There was no consultation at that time, and continues to be no consultation with the Navajo Nation related to the buffer zone. Consultation did occur with other tribes, but the medium was to meet the 10-mile buffer zone as a compromise to 5. That's why we reduced it. We did pass a resolution through our council, our Navajo Nation Council, to make it a 5-mile buffer zone. So that's the gist of where we sought to seek this mediation, was to meet that halfway. And the Navajo Nation is, just for the record, the Navajo Nation is working on a climate change, a lot of climate change efforts as well. We do have a climate change adaptation plan. So we are working on several issues related to climate change here on the Navajo Nation. Thank you.
But my question will be then, how important is that we do have a formal process of tribal consultation occur prior to making the decision, nor after the fact? And how will this have helped raise awareness about the decision's potential adverse implications for your communities?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. This decision was put forth, I don't think, without any really understanding to the severity of the impacts that this could make to our people who are those individual landowners. I think they were overlooked. And, with all the respect to the NGOs and other tribes, no consideration was given to them at hand. So this decision was put forth at whether it was influential or political, but this decision was severe enough to make a huge impact to our Navajo people there at the local level.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Let me now turn to Representative Tanco. You are recognized, sir.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chair?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, I apologize. We've had some problem with our audio this morning, so thank you for your patience. And I thank all of our witnesses for joining us and for the work that you do. Ms. Chatterjee, in your testimony, you discussed the lengthy and time-consuming nature of applying to many federal grant programs that are designed to increase access to critical services such as clean energy, drinking water, workforce training, and infrastructure. What are some of the greatest challenges that small or new organizations face throughout this process?
Thank you so much. It's a capacity issue predominantly. So organizations that are set up to have full-time staff to keep on top of where there are requests for proposals are able to access these resources. But organizations that are actually doing the work in their communities have many fewer people who are spending their time looking through the Federal Register for grant opportunities. Probably zero people, many fewer people who are able to read through, dozens of pages of instructional text, much less, incredibly detailed requirements. And so I think to open this up to our communities, we actually have to change some of these requirements, which is what we've learned to do, iteratively through our own, granted, very small grant-making process.
Thank you. And you also mentioned the importance of multi-year grants in your testimony. Last year, environmental foundations awarded more than 99% more funding to white-led organizations for multi-year grants, while BIPOC-led organizations received less than 1% of multi-year operational budget grants. So, Ms. Chatterjee, why are multi-year and capacity-building grants so important, particularly for BIPOC-led or grassroots organizations?
They're incredibly important for stability. So a lot of our organizations that are working on the ground in communities actually don't have the same care infrastructure or physical infrastructure of larger organizations. The same kind of like even public transit, just the same infrastructure. And so there's an inherent unpredictability of having been made vulnerable through policy over decades and even centuries. And the stability of multi-year grant giving makes it so people can make decisions about maybe can hire a staff member to do this really important clean water project, to do this really important climate resilience project. Really hard to hire somebody if you literally have 12 months in which to make a hiring decision, hire them, train them, get them doing the work, and then suddenly the time is up. There's I think part of it is just the inherent instability in which we're working means even longer multi-year grants would be helpful. And then you get shorter grants and you find that it's untenable from an implementation and planning perspective.
I hear you. So it fundamentally focuses on the fairness of it all and the resources you need to compete and compete effectively. From your perspective, how does increased funding through multi-year grants increase in NGOs' competitiveness in the federal grants process?
Again, I think it's the same kind of capacity constraints, right? Like there are organizations that are able to have, even to have a development director who has even 2% of their time to look at opportunities for funding. I think that, the other side of this is that there should be actually probably fewer openings for funding, but more time on outreach so that actually you don't have to, as an organization, have somebody full-time looking for these opportunities, but there's actually staff whose job it is to go look at like who's actually working in these communities, who could actually deliver these outcomes that we need in terms of climate resilience, clean water, transit equity, whatever it is. Make sure that the federal government is actually doing that outreach, so it's not just on the organization. With multi-year your funding, the organization can put some capacity to it, but it's still going to be limited, and it needs to come from both directions.
Well, I thank you for that. And it is clear to me that communities facing environmental injustice, as well as rural, disadvantaged, and impoverished communities in all of our districts bear the brunt of the effects of climate change and yet lack adequate access to critical federal programs. Ensuring that grants-making organizations reflect our nation's diverse tapestry and supporting the communities that have historically been left behind will be the way that we right the wrongs from decades of disinvestment and help us unlock America's full potential. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back. And again, sorry for the technical problems this morning.
I'm glad you got on. Thank you very much. Gentleman yields. You know, the whole issue about how agencies react, and you know, strikes me. You know, I recall during the previous administration when Secretary Zinke was in charge of Interior, he hired an old football buddy to manage grants and cooperative agreements for the Department of Interior. You raised the issue. Created a disruption of work that had been ongoing on issues such as climate change and effect. That was the authority within DOI to do exactly that. And I think that's what Mr. Graves was complaining about. And I hope going forward that there is some understanding that that kind of authority should not be all-encompassing as it was previously. So I'm glad that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are coming to that recognition that we came to a while back. But having said that, let me now ask Mr. McEachin. You're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for starting this very important conversation, or continuing this very important conversation. I'd like to start off by asking Mr. Dossunmu, whose name I've just butchered, and I apologize. Mr. Levin asked you a question that you gave a very thoughtful answer to concerning really the importance of people of color and indigenous people being able to get being involved in the environmental justice process. Can you explain some of the challenges you've had faced with getting funders to recognize that importance that you speak of racial and economic justice as a part of funding?
Thank you so much, Congressman, for the question. You know, the biggest challenges are that there is this set of unfortunate implicit biases that have shaped the funding community for a very long time, rooted in the lack of diversity, which we've already talked quite a bit about here today. And so part of the work is actually getting those funders to move beyond the inflexibility of their funding practices to see the work that is happening in our communities. It's a misnomer that to suggest that communities of color are not involved in the environmental movement. They're just not resourced. In many ways, they are leading the movement. But funders can't see that because they're wed to traditional funding practices. They're wed to a set of implicit biases. And so part of what we do is really highlight the work that's happening on the ground, highlight how it's shifting the power dynamics and really driving the movement forward, and really put that in front of funders and force them to reckon with that. And as I said, you know, we wrote to all of the major funders and we asked them, do you think, given the work that's happening on the ground, that 1.3% is a workable number, is a good number? And none of them said yes. Well, if you agree that it's not, then you have to take action to change your practices.
Thank you for that. And this next question might be a little bit of a curveball. So if you need to think about it and send us an answer, that's fine. But my office, along with other members, have written to some of these funders, asking them to reconsider their practices and include indigenous people, people of color, in terms of their funding. Even put folks within their own organizations who look like you and I do in charge of some of the money as they dole it out to these groups. What else can we do, not necessarily through legislation but through moral persuasion or our bully pulpit as congresspersons to help in this cause?
I think you hit the nail right on the head, Congressman, that it is the use of your bully pulpit and of the moral persuasion power of this body to push the field in a positive direction. And many of you, including yourself, Congressman, have been allies to our work in that regard. And we'd encourage others who have voices, particularly those who have voices with major funders in their communities, right, to start asking the questions, right? And again, I come back to that piece around some of what is able to persist in terms of these practices is able to persist because we don't ask the questions, we don't prompt the answers. And so really part of the work is asking the questions, asking funders to be transparent, asking them where their funding is going currently. And that has a way of forcing them to think internally and make changes. So that bully pulpit piece is really critically important.
Thank you. Ms. Chatterjee, uh, um, can you share with us some concrete ways that U.S. Climate Action Network has elevated the voices of Black and Indigenous people of color within the organization?
Yeah, thank you. So US CAN has been on quite a transformation process, and I don't want to pretend that our journey is done. We're constantly learning, but we have been able to pull our organization to putting justice at the heart of the work. And part of that is through giving explicit stipends and for collaborative work to members who are organizing in communities of color and are people of color themselves. Part of that is making sure that when we send representatives, whether it's to federal government processes or to United Nations processes, that we prioritize being represented by people of color. Our full membership votes, it's democratic, but we ask them to prioritize putting people of color into positions of access and influence. So that's just a few of the examples of what we've done, and we continue to be learning and on the journey.
Thank you for your hard work. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. McEachin. Gentleman yields. Let me now turn to the chair of the subcommittee. Ms. Porter, Representative Porter, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Funders and big green organizations and Black, Indigenous, and community leaders of color all seem to agree with the need to get more money to rural and minority-led nonprofits. But somewhere along the way, things are breaking down. Why? Why, Mr. Dossunmu, is that happening?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. The main thing, again, it goes to those implicit biases. It goes to those ingrained practices. It goes to, in fact, who the funders are talking to and hearing from. I think part of the work of shifting the field in a different direction is actually creating tables and spaces for funders to see the work that is happening on the ground in communities and be able to fund that work. And they have blind spots currently that don't allow them to see it. And so part of what we have to do is really push them to get beyond those blind spots and see the impactful work that's happening.
I know there's a big size difference in some cases between sort of the largest foundations and those organizations and nonprofits that are often, led by and focusing on involving and engaging, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. Do you ever hear the argument that, funders don't want to take on the sort of responsibility of these smaller organizations, and sort of the smaller the organization, even though it's less donor dollars, somehow the donor feels that they would be taking on too much. They don't want to be the sole funder. And how can we deal with that argument if you've heard that?
We have absolutely heard that. And, the reality is that it's a false concept. And it creates a vicious cycle because they say, well, we don't want to fund the smallest organizations. The smallest organizations don't get funding and they don't get the opportunity to grow and build capacity. And so, part of what we have really driven home is that funding these organizations is not a liability. Funding these organizations is funding the most impactful work that is happening on the ground in communities across the country. They are the organizations that are moving the needle. So by not funding them, you're missing out on the opportunity to really change the game. And so it's driving home that message and really making the moral case for it, but also making the strategic case for it, is that it's not a liability, it's an asset to the movement to fund these organizations.
Yeah, because for many of those smaller organizations, I would think the choice is going to be between having maybe a sole donor or no donor at all,
Right.
and ceasing to exist. So I think that's really important. You mentioned about getting the right people at the table, and I wanted to follow up about that. Do these larger donors, funders, and bigger green organizations, do they have the right staff to be able to improve in terms of seeing and recognizing the groups that are closest to the communities who have been hurt by environmental damage and are in need of environmental justice?
The short answer is no, Congresswoman, they don't. But that's a critical question because it highlights the ways in which each leg of the Jedi stool is connected to the other, right? So you can't get to real and meaningful equity until you get to real and meaningful diversity. But the lack of diversity is what drives the inequity in the system. And so, part of the conversations that we're having is not only about pushing those funders to see BIPOC organizations that are doing the work, but also pushing those funders to build the internal infrastructure and the internal commitments that will get them to a place where they can affirm that work. And so it's not just on them to say, we're making a commitment to transparency, we're making a commitment to the 30%. It's also on them to say, we're going to make a commitment to do the culture change work that is required of us in order to get to those numbers.
In your testimony, you mentioned California's environmental justice legislation as a success story. Can you just say a little bit more in your final few seconds here about the coalition that helped make that a reality and what lessons we might learn?
Absolutely. So, we emphasize the work of the CEGA and their work in really convening a table of community organizations to advance a number of initiatives in California. And the important thing to note about that is that what California has done really has been the model for President Biden's Justice 40 initiative. And so that's another way in which BIPOC leadership is actually lighting the way for federal advancement on this very important issue. If you don't have the California laws, you don't have the New Jersey laws, you don't have the current federal commitment at all. And so we're losing out on an opportunity to support that work when we don't fund the BIPOC organizations like CEGA and others that have been critical to the work in California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And let me now invite and recognize Representative Soto for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Back in 2014 in Florida, when I was in the state legislature, we had an amendment that got on the ballot known popularly as Amendment 1, and it was a public land acquisition amendment. And I had the opportunity to work with some major conservation organizations in the district, Florida Conservation Voters, Audubon Society, Sierra Club. And it was towards the end, around September, they had conversations about how to outreach with the Hispanic community. And we did this at a local area in Kissimmee as we were talking about how important the environment was to communities of color, to our rural communities. And so they put in money in the last month and a half for Hispanic Spanish language outreach. What do we see? The amendment passed by 70% of the vote, but among the Hispanic community, we voted for it by 75%. We outpaced the rest of the state. And after bringing folks out to the Kissimmee Lakefront, first of all, it was funded by the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So we're already seeing federal programs make a big difference. But they saw folks are very committed to being outdoors as Floridians, very into recreation, hiking, kayaking, fishing, hunting, doing all these different things outdoors. Even a lot of our celebrations are outdoors in these areas, or Moss Park, another area that benefited from the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Our communities are also affected through utilities, where they're sited, the air and water quality that relates to that. And we see this also in our territories like Puerto Rico, as well as tribes like the Seminole tribe in Florida, which is why we're excited that we passed a few of these key issues out of committee, the Kissimmee River, Wild Scenic River bill, which I appreciate the chairman helping pass that out. That will help clean water and recreation in a very Hispanic area of our district, and a very rural area as well. Restoring resilient reefs passed out of the House just recently, which is key for our state's clean water, habitat, tourism, you name it. Again, lots of communities of color living in the Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach County areas. And then $1 billion just recently by President Biden for the Everglades, biggest award by far ever to help with clean water, habitat, recreation. We're seeing these themes over and over. And that also affects the Seminole tribe, which for years has had to endure terrible water quality because of pollution. Locally, we just had OUC agree to close their coal plant over the next few years. And local Latinas with Moms Clean Air Force were a big part of that. I was proud to work with them, and now we're working on solar. Why? Because that coal plant was in their community in East Orange County, and they stood up, and I was proud to join them. But that's some examples of folks maybe not always early on, but eventually realizing, wow, this is not only morally right, which is the most important thing, but it's also a smart long-term strategy to build lasting coalitions to enact change. Ms. Chatterjee, in your testimony, you briefly mentioned how addressing only diversity or inclusion alone is insufficient to move the needle in any meaningful way. Can you elaborate on why it's critical for mainstream environmental organizations to advance all the principles of JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion?
Thank you for the question and for sharing those examples from Florida. Diversity is an important basis and first step, but it's not the whole journey. People don't know what they don't know. You can hire a group of people of color, but if they're not familiar with the situation at hand, it takes time to develop expertise and understand what the equity and justice interventions needed are made. And there's nothing necessarily about being a person of color that inherently makes you understand these issues, right? And so even although it is a critically important first step, it's totally insufficient to actually achieving justice and equity. There have to be additional steps made, both for inclusiveness, so people stay once you've hired a diverse workforce, but then also to make sure that next step is made to putting racial justice and economic justice at the heart of the initiatives and work.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Ms. Chatterjee. I think if we all focus on hiring local, hiring early as we're working on initiatives across the United States, that's at least incremental change we could do that we've seen work in Florida as we work on the greater wealth consolidation issues that affect not only the environmental community, but let's face it, all of America. So thank you for the time and your focus on this today, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Soto. Gentleman yields. Let me now invite Vice Chair of the committee, Mr. Garcia. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and of course, all the witnesses that have joined us today. The work of this committee has done to dismantle environmental racism, restore and preserve our nation's lands, and uplift the importance of clean air and a healthy environment has had a significant impact on the life of people in Chicagoland. However, it is well known that we as lawmakers don't do this work alone. As an elected representatives, we have a responsibility to carry with us the voices of our constituents, and with that comes great responsibility. That said, we reach out to the brightest minds across the world, many of which I would argue reside in my district, to craft the most impactful policies. And it's important that the partners that we work closely with understand the practical and tangible benefits of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and why historically that has not always been the case. some questions for our panelists. Mr. Forbes, it's well documented that the early American conservation movement was exclusionary and often disparaging of communities of color. You have already pointed to some instances. In fact, writings from an early leader of the conservation movement described Indigenous and Black people as dirty, lazy, and uncivilized. In your view, how has that Troubled Foundation determined which environmental policies tend to be prioritized, and are certain communities and their priorities still being left out?
Thank you so much, Congressman. Of course they are, is the short answer. The origin stories that you speak about, we in the environmental movement, we have to speak about them. We have to acknowledge them. That is the only way. It's not about shaming us or punishing us. It's the only way to liberate us to actually do the work that we need to do. A key tenet of this conversation has been about prioritizing the most affected. I think the only path to getting there is by acknowledging how we have failed to do that in the past. Every time I've seen that happen, sir, I think the organizations have come out of that process stronger and more capable then of making space and standing beside others to allow them to lead and carry the work.
Thank you, Mr. Forbes. Question for Mr. Dossunmu. In my community, organizers on the ground are often driving most of our impactful climate wins. In Chicago Southeast and Southwest sides, communities are fighting to reject plants that are proposed that would increase pollution levels in an already burdened community. Mr. Dossunmu, from your perspective, why is it important that these stories and locally driven environmental movements are being shared and supported by mainstream environmental organizations and foundations?
Thank you so much, Congressman. And I will just say that the work happening in your district is very close to my heart. I lived on the south side of Chicago during college. So I know that work and that area very well, and the organizations that are lifting up that work. And what I will say is that, many funders are operating under a false notion that you can do environmental work without power building work. And I think part of what the example that you've laid out, the examples that you've laid out in your district highlight, is that communities of color understand that that work cannot be disconnected from power building work. And so they're actually working not just to tackle kind of traditional environmental notions, but they're also working to build meaningful political power among those residents so that they are able to really shift the center of gravity environmentally. And so the reason it's important to lift up those examples is that it really highlights the intersectionality of environmentalism and meaningful power building in communities of color.
Thank you. And I'll just end with this. Black and brown leaders and organizations and individuals must be engaged, uplifted, and supported if we're to truly tackle the climate crisis. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Garcia. Let me now recognize Representative Cohen. Sir, you're recognized. Mr. Cohen, you're recognized. You are recognized. Senator Terhan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Yep, and thank you to the witnesses here today. I'm so glad we're having this hearing today. If future generations are going to care for and support the protection of public lands and waters, then public land agencies will have to work to ensure that these places are accessible and relevant to the day-to-day lives of residents. The city that I'm from, Lowell, Massachusetts, is incredibly diverse. More than 60 languages are spoken throughout the city, and immigrants have come from all over to make Lowell home. My Brazilian grandmother, who immigrated to Lowell, used to work in the very mill that is now my congressional office. And this is the American dream at its absolute best. Not only is a former mill my congressional office, but it's also part of the Lowell National Historic Park. The park is a treasure in our community and includes a museum that educates visitors about Lowell's rich history as an industrial mill town that immigrants like my grandparents helped build. Right now, the park is working with the local community to co-create a new exhibit called One City, Many Cultures. And this exhibit will update the existing immigrant exhibit that opened back in 1988. Over the last 30 years, Lowell's demographics, like many other cities, continue to change, making an update necessary. And this new exhibit will tell the stories of diverse cultures, as well as the cultural changes that Lowell has witnessed. When it's completed, it will feature panels written in English and Spanish. Viewers will be able to listen to Khmer being spoken. And there will even be a section dedicated to a storybook in which guests can record their own stories. This initiative demonstrates the potential that urban parks have to educate, connect, and strengthen our local communities. However, uneven access to parks, especially urban parks, and funding systems that have historically steered their investments toward richer locales have ignored a vital group of stakeholders and change leaders for far too long. One way to increase access is for agencies as well as nonprofits to adopt and implement policies so that public lands and conservation workforce reflects the growing diversity in our nation, both in rank and file positions and throughout the leadership ranks. So, Ms. Chatterjee, thank you for being here. I'm wondering if you can speak to the importance of access to urban parks for communities like Lowell.
Sure. Thank you so much for your question. I actually went to Lowell for a big Bengali conference once, just a testament to immigrant communities being attracted to Lowell, Massachusetts. But yeah, it's incredibly important in terms of making sure that young people have access to supportive infrastructure, care and physical infrastructure and parks within their communities in terms of like the future we want, right? Like I spend my time working to fight the climate crisis so that we can have communities where our kids can thrive and learn about our history and have jobs. And I think that, historically, there have been big efforts to push these things. Right now, one of the things we've been talking about is the Civilian Climate Corps. One of the things we could do with the Civilian Climate Corps is make sure that we do have urban parks being put together, but also rural parks being put together. There's no reason why we shouldn't be putting every single person to work, putting together the things that we need as communities, right? The core things we need in order to thrive. And so I think it's critically important as just a piece of what makes our communities beautiful and what we're all fighting for.
Terrific. Well, thank you for visiting Lowell, and hopefully we can welcome you back there soon. I grew up in Lowell, and urban park had an incredible impact on my childhood and my upbringing. I'm wondering what you see as the greatest challenge to creating more urban parks across our country, like the one in Lowell.
I think the greatest challenge is lack of funding, and the greatest challenge to lack of funding is the lack of our ability to get policies through, which comes back to what we're all here to talk about, which is like, why can't we get these policies done that we need? It's because we're not being inclusive and bringing in the communities that actually have the power of the community behind them to get things passed, not just talked about, but actually passed. So once we, having the money means that we can have the parks.
Great. Well, I appreciate all of that. And certainly I believe that all politics is local, but I also think that all activism, all history, and certainly our action on climate is also local too. So I appreciate your answers and your being here today. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields. Let me recognize Representative Tlaib for 5 minutes. Your questions, comments?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you so much for our panelists. I really appreciate, Chairman, for you being such a champion in environmental justice issues. You know how personal that issue is to me. I represent, some of you might know already, some of the most polluted neighborhoods in Michigan. And for us, environmental justice isn't a choice. It's a daily fight for survival. Many of my residents have steel mills and oil refineries for neighbors, literally feet away from their front steps. They have auto factories and power plants in their backyards. The cumulative impact of all these pollution sources combining together is a toxic, cocktail that my residents ingest every single day, and so do their children. These communities have high rates of asthma, cancer, respiratory disease. Our environmental decision-making is literally killing communities of color. And these communities have been, shut out always in policymaking and advocacy spaces for far too long. You all know the fossil fuel industry, the lobbyist. I'm left another committee hearing and just hearing of the gaslighting and the misleading information by the industry, changing their names, talking about it in a way when at the end, we're still breathing dirty air. So I like to emphasize the sense of urgency we need at this moment. If you have 20 major source air polluters within a couple miles of your home, you're going to act with a lot more urgency than someone living in a safer, cleaner community. Look where shutting our frontline environmental justice communities out of the halls of power has gotten us. I mean, look at it. No meaningful climate action as we continue hurtling, towards planetary, doom. Corporate polluters continue to make record profits. The more even subsidy we give them, everything, they keep again profiting off of our public health disaster and our environmental disaster. So I'm proud that in my district we have so many environmental justice groups that have the JDI values ingrained into the fabric of their organizations. Groups like Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition, Solidarity, We Want Green Too are walking the walk, and it's part of what makes me very much an effective partner here in bringing their voices to the halls of Congress. Ms. Chatterjee, just even hearing you talk about this, I don't know, it just reminds me how exhausting it is, how incredibly exhausting it is that we're giving these platforms, talking about it over and over again. Like, I'm tired of the public hearings. I go, Chairman, I go, I submit comments, I get my residents submit comments, and nothing changes. It's exhausting. I mean, Ms. Chatterjee, how would empowering frontline Black and Brown, Indigenous environmental justice leaders actually impact federal environmental policymaking change for U.S. climate action? What does empowerment really look like? Tell my colleagues on this committee what to do.
Thank you so much. I think what to do is know the names of the environmental justice communities in your district, talk to them, bring them in, make sure they're the first folks that you ask when a decision is coming up. Make sure that when we're getting closer and closer and negotiations are happening, what continually feels like it happens is that the most important issues for Black and Brown communities get negotiated away by people who don't speak for that community. And so making sure that doesn't happen is an incredibly powerful position to be in. And I'm just grateful that we have all of you in that position, because we are out of time. Lives are at stake, and we've got to make this change in who we listen to and who we believe has the solutions. I think you're doing it. A lot of you are doing it, and it's nice to see, but we just got to go faster and harder.
Yeah, Chairman needs more help from our committee, and we're going to work hard on getting that done. Mr. Dossunmu, I hope I said it right, because people torture my name. Your testimony mentioned, of course, the $1.34 billion awarded to 12 national environmental funders, and only 1.3 went to, communities of color-led justice-focused groups. What would directing hundreds of millions? I mean, I already know this answer, but I want colleagues to understand, and I think it was something that Ms. Chatterjee kind of talked about. But how can it really, because I know it will accelerate that kind of urgency I've been talking about, but give us some examples of how injecting and investing in the communities impacted the most would look like in policymaking.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your question. I grew up in a community very similar to the one you represent, that you've described, around these issues. And what I know, again, is that the most transformative solutions are happening at the community level. So injecting hundreds of millions of dollars into BIPOC-led organizations will get you imaginative thinking, like the thinking that the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy is doing around just transition, or the work that Green Latinos is doing around closing toxic landfills, or the work that the California Environmental Justice Alliance is to pull Black and Brown and Indigenous communities together to really push for transformative legislation at the state level, right? Like that, there are tangible benefits to injecting money into BIPOC-led organizations. And the most tangible benefit is that we actually resource the best solutions, which is not what we are doing right now.
No, thank you, and I yield. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentlelady yields. Thank you very much. Let me recognize Mr. Cohen. Sir, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Cohen? Representative Cohen, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Recognizing myself, there seems to be Mr. Westerman. Is there anyone on your side of the aisle that wishes to be recognized that is not at this point?
Not at this point, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Cohen, are you available at this point? There's some technical difficulty with Mr. Cohen's connection. Let me recognize myself, otherwise we'll be here in limbo for a while. I want to, I mentioned in the opening remarks, and I have some questions that are pertinent to this hearing, but I mentioned the remarks that, that the issue of JEDI and what we're dealing with here in terms of integrating justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, not only into mainstream environmental institutions, but the discussion has been more expansive than that. It's not just a moral necessity, it's a very, very practical necessity. And as you exclude voices from diverse and impacted communities in decision-making process, all those policies that are made around those issues they fall short of the goals. In fact, the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a report just last year that underscores how advancing JEDI in environmental institutions is necessary to ensure that the federal environmental policies are designed to work for all Americans. They also said in that report that environmental foundations, to quote, need to prioritize addressing both the severe racial justice and equity disparities in their funding of climate NGOs and the diversity of their board and staff advisors. I mentioned that, but let me just talk about two issues that came up from the witnesses and also from the questions that my colleagues asked. And one has to do with the issue of capacity building and empowerment. And both to Ms. Chatterjee and Mr. Dossunmu, if you could respond to this question, and also respond what you saw what the National Academy said. Capacity building. Let me just take one example. Cumulative impact. And the frustration that many impacted communities have of a single source analysis versus a cumulative analysis that it's impacting a whole community, the public health of that community, and the general environment of that community. With capacity in terms of resources, the ability for communities to be able to deal with this question much more effectively. Your response to that, I use that as one example of where capacity building, I think, is critical to impacted communities to be able to to make their point at the table. Ms. Chatterjee?
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely agree with the findings of the National Academy of Sciences that that you're raising here. That it actually is more impactful to bring communities to the table. And in terms of capacity building, my view is that often that capacity is best brought through just unrestricted grant dollars. I think oftentimes what we see is that foundations feel that they know what capacity an organization might need, and they sometimes are right and they're sometimes are wrong. And so our inclination is to argue for unrestricted grants to community of color led organizations organizing in community of color, doing that work so they can decide for themselves if is what they need most, media training, or is what they need most a scientific analysis. I think that it really depends on the time and the community. And so our inclination is to encourage unrestricted grants for capacity building.
Yeah, and let me Mr. Dossunmu, let me just kind of rephrase another question. I said it was practical, and that these are practical things that need to be done in order to be effective for environmental institutions and NGOs, mainstream ones. But it applies us as well to the policymakers in government, because there's a relationship to that policy development and the NGOs outside. And I asked a question about the practicality. As this country continues to become more diverse, the need for inclusivity also applies to the issue that we're talking about here today, the environment in general, not only the climate issue that we must do something about, but also the long-term conservation that also must be part of this nation's policy, and how these new constituencies are the role that they're going to play in the future in the protection of our public lands, waters, and dealing with climate. Why, there is a practical policy importance to recognizing that inclusion is necessary for the long term.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Congressman, for the question. I think part of it is recognizing that the earlier you bring communities in and the more substantively you engage those communities, the better off your policy making is going to be. And so currently what community engagement looks like and community outreach looks like is that it's almost a box that funders check, or in some cases that elected officials check, and it's really not substantive. It's not driven by a desire to have deep connectivity with the communities and the organizations that are doing the most important work. And so, one of the things that I can say from the vast experience that I have in this space is that often decisions are imposed on our communities. They happen to our communities. They don't emanate up from our communities. And we have to shift that dynamic if we really want to meaningfully address the crisis that is at hand. We have to make sure that the most thoughtful and most innovative ideas and policies actually are able to influence the public discourse and the ultimate policy outcomes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And let me now go back to and recognize Mr. Cohen for 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know that I need that time particularly, but I appreciate your coming back. I've had technical problems in getting back up to the committee. But at the beginning of the committee, my friend, the ranking member, made a lot of comments about inflation and how that's harmed so many poor people with the cost of energy. I just realized that inflation, and I'm sure my friend knows this as well, is a worldwide problem. And that inflation is in Brazil, and it's in Germany, and it's in everywhere in Europe and all around the world. It's not a problem that President Biden is not aware of and attacking, but it's not something he has done because it's a worldwide problem. And a lot of it relates to the pandemic, and President Biden has done so much to try to encourage people who are resistant to doing it, including people in our Congress on the other side of the aisle on the floor to wear masks, to be concerned about others and not spread the virus, and to get vaccinated and boosted. And too many people in red states predominantly have not cooperated. They have not gotten vaccinated. They have not worn masks, and they spread the virus. And it's been shown Tennessee, my home state, is about generally first in the country in number of people infected because we have almost no policies from our governor concerning wearing masks. This avoidance of science is hurting our country and hurting poor people more than it is wealthier people. And when you have the problems we've got with climate change, which is one of the deals we have with fossil fuels, it's poor people that don't have the money in summer when it gets so hot, in the winter, summer when it gets so hot, to go to Colorado or one of their Wyoming or one of their little resorts, or when it gets cold in the winter and miserable, they can't go to Naples, Florida, because they can't afford it, where the wealthy can go. So climate change has a disproportionate effect on poor people. And that's why we need to be concerned about it. I was looking at Plan B yesterday. Plan B was published about, I think, 15, 20 years ago. And we're still not getting around to Plan B. And we're out using Mother Earth. And we're taking too many resources out of it and putting too many pressures on it. And it only has a limited capacity. And we're over that capacity. And we're not going to be around when it runs out of steam and runs out of ability to absorb and to provide water and provide necessary resources and to work as it should. But it's just a problem. And that's one of the questions I was going to ask earlier, Mr. Chair, and I know you're aware of them, but I get tired of hearing Republicans talk about inflation and talk about the supply chain, which are worldwide problems, much of which has to do with China and the pandemic and closing down and not getting goods out to market. And ships have been averages 4 days sitting off ports on the supply chain. It's worse now, but it's always been somewhat bad. Anyway, that's one thing that I wanted to get off my chest, which I guess I've done. Is Delegate Freeland's no longer with us, is he? Does anybody that's with us on the panel represent particularly Native American Indians?
I'm here, Representative Cohen.
Okay, thank you, Delegate. I just wanted to get your perspective on how Deb Haaland, our former colleague and my friend, is doing as the Secretary of the Interior concerning Native American Indian issues.
That's a very good question. That yet has to be determined, Congressman. We haven't had an opportunity to speak with her. I say that. That's why. We don't know what her intentions are. We don't know what her thoughts are. We don't know. So that's yet to be determined, Congressman. Thank you.
Have you made an attempt to talk with her?
Yes, we did, Congressman. We were actually out there last week, and we did request to meet with her directly related to the issue of Chaco Canyon, but we never got a response.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm very concerned about the horses and the burros out in the west. And of course, they get in a fight with the cattle farmers and who has the right to the land. And I'm concerned that we ought to be doing more with the scientific efforts to reduce their population and not herding them up and then having them end up in pens and herding them in the roundups with helicopters and all that. And I'm just concerned.
They confirmed that.
Excuse me?
They've been trying.
I didn't hear whatever somebody was saying. Maybe somebody was not muted. But the bottom line is, and it may be kind of simplistic, but I was thinking Native American Indians, horses were their friends, and the cattle farmers weren't. And I don't know if things have changed that much. And I wish that we had better results from the Department of the Interior on taking care of our four-legged friends and their opportunities to graze and not be treated inhumanely. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields, and no other members. And let me just thank the witnesses for their very, very valuable testimony, the members for their questions, and for the questions that some of those questions brought up, and those are important as well. And the members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask them to respond and we'll ask you to respond to those in writing under committee rule. Members of the committee will submit witness questions within 3 business days following that hearing, and it will be open for 10 business days for the responses. Before closing and thanking everybody once again, I think this has been a very good hearing. You know, the effort to rewrite history or erase it is, well, some attempt is being done at that. The fact is it can't happen. It's about correcting past practices and redirecting history so we don't repeat those mistakes again. And I think that the discussion today goes to that issue. And it's about capacity, it's about inclusion, but it's also about beginning to develop the kinds of policies and integrate them fully, and the legislative initiatives that are going to give marginalized communities, diverse communities, those that are most impacted, least attended to, not just the opportunity, but the empowerment to be able to have some a significant say over the quality of their particular lives and their communities' lives. And I think it's important. The nexus for Chaco was always, Mr. Freeland, the protection and perpetuity of the Chaco landscape, its facilities, its cultural, its religious and spiritual significance. That can, and the buffer and withdrawal, whether 5-10 discussion going on, is with that intent. And that intent was driven by a variety of advocacy on the part of many tribes across this country, in New Mexico, and the then administration in Navajo Nation. So that those discussions were ongoing, but the nexus that I believe we all agree with is in perpetuity, the conservation and protection of that landscape. The other issue is the one that came up about the question of using slave labor in order to acquire our precious or rare minerals for import into this country. Nobody supports that concept. And I think if we're going to be consistent, I would extend to my colleagues the invitation to join with some of us in the prohibition of this federal government of ours doing business with multinational and conglomerates and corporations that are doing business on public land and water, but have a track record of environmental, labor abuse, and now a cultural resource abuse, and the exploitation and abuse of women. That we not do business with them, i.e. Rio Tinto Mining Company. So if we're going to be consistent on one end and prohibit the import, we should also prohibit them having access to our public lands to be able to do business, not pay any royalties, and continue the practices outside outside our country. We're going to be consistent and supply the rule to all. But we're going to go forward with this. I want to thank the staff for this meeting, and without no further business for the meeting, we're adjourned.